What if I told you, there once was a sword that did not thirst for blood but for light, forged in the breath between thunder and prayer, a blade that hummed with the memory of angels, and in its reflection, kings saw both their salvation and their fall. They said its edge could divide truth from illusion, that when David held it, the heavens leaned closer, and the wind itself bent to listen. But after his last psalm faded, it was hidden, buried beneath the silence of time, guarded not by men but by memory. Some say it was made of celestial ore, hammered by those who watched from the stars before the flood. Others whisper it was not forged but sung, that its sound was the first song of victory ever heard in heaven. And somewhere in the shifting light of forgotten ages, the sword waits still, humming beneath stone, yearning to remember its master. Close your eyes. If your spirit feels this calling, walk with us now. This was meant for you to hear. When you listen, you awaken something heaven chose not to erase. Stay close. Let us follow the echo that never died. Before the sound of iron, before the echo of battle, before even the thought of kings, there was only the breath. It moved like light unseen, weaving through the darkness with the patience of eternity. Some called it wind, some called it spirit, but the old ones whispered that it was the voice of God rehearsing creation. From that voice came tone, and from tone the first song. It was not sung by angels or men, but by existence itself, trembling to become known. The mountains were not yet stone, nor the rivers yet water, but the vibration that would one day shape them already wept beneath the silence. The heavens watched as melody unfolded itself like wings. Each note became an element, each pause a star. Sound became matter, and matter became memory. In that sacred collision between the invisible and the visible, a spark was born, a spark that hummed with both awe and sorrow. This was the first hint of the sword that would one day rest in David's hand, not forged by hammer but conceived in sound. It was the music of creation folding itself into purpose, the word beginning to dream of shape. Before there was fire, there was harmony. Before there was blade, there was breath. The unseen forges glowed in the darkness of the deep, where no eye could look and live. There among the secret fires stood the watchers, those who had seen light before time began. They did not speak, for speaking would have broken the rhythm. They only listened as the divine moved through them, bending frequency into form. And in the heart of that sound, a song began to separate itself from all others. It was sharper, brighter, yet filled with a longing that no eternity could satisfy. The song became weight. The weight became edge. And the edge waited. Eons passed like moments in the silence of heaven. The stars took their places, the seas learned their names, and still the sword slept in resonance. Hidden in the folds of sound, it dreamed of being held not by an angel whose perfection would make it sterile, but by a mortal whose weakness would teach it purpose. For the sword was never made to conquer, it was made to remember. Its edge would not cut through flesh but through illusion. Its light would not blind but reveal. And so it waited for man. When the first dawn rose over Eden, the song trembled, sensing the birth of souls that could hear. Adam walked beneath the trees, and for a moment the wind itself seemed to pause, wondering if this new being might remember the sound it came from. But the memory faded when the fruit was taken and the silence deepened. Still, the sword slept, buried not in earth, but in the secret place between spirit and sound. Then came the generations. The flood, the fall, the wandering. The world grew heavy with noise, and heaven grew quiet in its grief. But the music endured. It waited beneath thunder, within the heartbeat of prophets, and the strings of harps that sang in the night. Every note of faith, every cry of despair, was an echo calling the sword back into being. For though it had never yet been seen, it had already been promised, a covenant hidden in vibration. Somewhere in the vast stillness beyond sight, the forge was lit again. The stars leaned closer as divine fire rippled through unseen air, shaping tone into metal. There was no blacksmith, only will, no bellows, only breath. And when the final chord struck through the void, a light flashed so bright that even angels turned away. From that flash came the essence of what would one day become the sword of David, a blade born not of war, but of worship. It shimmered in that sacred place between creation and consequence, humming with the rhythm of heaven. It sang of justice before injustice had a name. It carried mercy before wrath was known. And though no human eye yet saw it, the earth already felt its memory. The wind that touched the deserts carried its whisper. The rivers that ran toward the sea murmured its refrain. Long before the shepherd sang his first psalm, long before kings wore crowns or prophets wept beneath stars, the sword was already dreaming. It was not a thing of iron, but of sound, a promise waiting for a voice. And somewhere in the silence of time, that voice began to stir. There was a place before places, a realm without shadow or soil, where sound alone was the measure of being. The old texts call it the hall of breath, others the chamber of echoes. It was there that the divine first listened to itself, and in listening created. The halls were not built of stone but of resonance, shimmering like the surface of still water beneath invisible suns. Each tone that moved through it carried the color of a thought, the scent of unseen rain, the memory of joy before time began. In that place, what would one day be called metal slept as pure vibration, waiting for intention to give it shape. And among those waiting harmonies, one sound trembled differently, clear, unwavering, piercing like light through storm. It did not seek attention. It sought purpose. The watchers heard it first, those sentinels of dawn who guard the veil between form and unformed. They bowed before it as one bows before prophecy. They knew this sound was not for them. It was meant for something small, fragile, and miraculous, a heart made of dust that could love. Ages passed in the stillness. The music that shaped mountains and rivers grew fainter, drowned beneath the clamor of mankind learning to speak. Yet even as kingdoms rose from clay, the faint echo remained. It was found in the pulse of stars, in the fall of rain upon stone, in the tremor of every living heartbeat. It was the seed of remembrance, the song waiting to be called by name. When the world grew loud, the heavens grew quieter until only a few could hear it anymore. Shepherds in the night, their faces lifted to the stars, felt it beneath their ribs but could not name it. Prophets wept in deserts, mistaking its hum for loneliness. The sword's melody haunted them not as noise but as yearning, for it was never a call to battle, it was a call home. One evening in a forgotten century, a boy born among fields heard the sound more clearly than most. He was not yet David, not yet crowned or chosen. He was only a dreamer with a harp playing to sheep and stars. But when he strummed his strings, something ancient awoke. The air thickened. The night grew luminous. The music that drifted from his hands did not belong to him. It belonged to the beginning. The same tone that once shaped the world answered through him, bending his melody toward something older than memory. And in that instant, the heavens remembered. The sound of David's harp was like light rediscovering its voice. Angels, hearing it, trembled with the recognition of creation's first note. The watchers, long silent, stirred once more, and the forge beyond sight flared like the sun's first breath. The sword that had slept in resonance began to awaken. Invisible currents flowed across eternity, drawing the unformed metal toward the world of dust and heartbeat. It was said that on that night a single star pulsed thrice, not as sign, but as rhythm marking the rebirth of sacred sound in the mortal realm. The boy played without knowing what he summoned. His eyes closed, his fingers trembling, he felt only a strange peace, as though something vast and ancient was listening through him. The sheep slept. The moon paused. Even the crickets forgot their song. And in that stillness, a promise long buried in silence stirred again. Somewhere, deep beneath the veil of heaven, the unfinished sword shimmered with recognition. It remembered the voice of its maker, and it remembered its purpose: to dwell among the faithful, to divide truth from illusion, and to sing only when guided by love. But it could not yet cross the boundary. It needed fire, not the fire of the forge, but of the soul. It waited for the boy to become more than a shepherd, for his heart to bear the weight of both beauty and sorrow. Only then could the melody take form in steel. And so it slept once more, humming softly within the wind, hidden in the space between every heartbeat. Above him the stars leaned closer as though whispering, "Not yet, but soon." The night deepened. David's fingers fell silent upon the strings. He looked toward the horizon and felt an ache he could not name, the ache of a promise older than the world itself. The heavens listened, the earth waited, and the sword dreamed of hands that could hold it without trembling. Night after night the boy returned to that hill where the silence spoke. The stars above seemed to hum in patterns, not of light, but of remembrance. He could not explain it, but each time his fingers touched the harp, something unseen drew closer, like a tide of invisible wings brushing the edges of his soul. The sound he made no longer felt his own. It rose from beneath his ribs, from the ancient pulse that first gave breath to man. And when the wind caught it, the fields glowed faintly, as though the grass itself was listening. It was said that in those nights, the air became alive, shimmering, trembling, waiting. The boy would play until dawn, and in the space between each note he began to hear a voice. Not in words, but in awareness, a knowing that pressed softly against his heart. It did not command, it remembered. It spoke of the forge before stars, of fire that sang, of blades made not for war but for witness. And though David could not yet understand, his soul leaned toward the sound like a flower toward light. There came a night when the sky broke open in silver silence. No wind moved, no beast stirred. The stars themselves appeared to bow. The boy looked upward and saw what no mortal eyes were meant to see, the shimmer of form moving within the heavens where sound becomes shape. It was not vision, but recognition. The ancient melody that had slept within him all his life began to echo through his veins, and he fell to his knees, weeping without knowing why. The earth beneath him pulsed as though something far below was stirring, a hum beneath the soil, faint but endless, like the beating heart of creation itself. In that moment, the first light of the sword of David flickered into being. It was not seen, only felt, a warmth that pierced the very marrow of the world. The heavens exhaled and the mountains shuddered. The rivers turned their faces to the east and the stones remembered their maker. For the first time since the beginning, heaven's forge opened again. The music of creation began its descent into form. And in that sacred instant, something remarkable occurred. The harp in David's hands trembled. Its strings glowed faintly with pale fire, and for a heartbeat the music changed. It became layered like two songs woven together, his and another. The second was not of this earth. It was vast, ancient, filled with a grief too holy to be sorrow. When it faded, the air seemed thinner, emptier, as if something infinite had just brushed against time and passed through. David lay in the grass, shaking, his tears wetting the soil. He whispered, "Who am I?" And the wind answered, though softly, "You are the memory we left in clay." He did not know it, but the blade was already bound to his name. The sound that had moved through him would one day be the sound of its edge, the hum of divine order clothed in mortal obedience. It would wait for him, hidden in the breath of prophecy, until the day his hands were ready. For now, the only forge that mattered was the one within his heart. The nights that followed were quieter. The sound did not return in such force. Yet something within him had changed, the way he heard the world, the way silence breathed between sounds. He found music even in stillness now, and every time he played, he felt that same subtle ache of recognition, as though eternity were listening from behind the veil. Years would pass before the sword took form in steel, but already its melody had chosen him. Already, the heavens had bent their attention toward the shepherd whose faith made light remember its name. And somewhere beyond stars and storms, in the hall of breath where creation first sang, the watchers turned their gaze toward earth and whispered, "It has begun." The forge that needed no flame stirred once more, and the sound of its awakening rolled like thunder through eternity. The dawn after that night carried a different light, not brighter, but aware, as though the horizon itself had begun to listen. The boy awoke in the field surrounded by stillness, and in the silence that followed, he could hear the faint echo of something ancient sighing through the air. The sheep grazed calmly, unafraid. Even the sparrow seemed to sing in harmony with the wind. It was as if all creation was breathing in the same rhythm, the same pulse that had once set the stars aflame. He stood and touched his harp again, but the song had changed. It was quieter now, more like memory than sound. Every note he plucked felt like stepping into a river that had always known his name. He closed his eyes and let it guide him. His fingers moved not from practice, but from prayer. And as he played, the world shifted gently, folding inward not around him, but within him. He felt the mountains hum beneath the soil, the rivers exhale as they wound toward the sea, and somewhere deep beyond thought, a whisper, "Do not forget." The boy did not yet know what that meant. He only felt the trembling peace of being seen by something vast, unseen, and kind. For in the breath between the notes he sensed what no tongue could tell, that all creation still carried a song, waiting for someone to remember it. And when he did, the line between heaven and earth thinned to near transparency. That night he could not sleep. The stars above him seemed too alive to ignore. He sat beside a small fire and watched its flame dance with strange awareness, as though remembering another fire, one from before the first dawn. The ember cracked, and in that sound he felt the forge breathe again. He understood then that the light which would one day form the sword was already among them, hidden in things small and humble, in warmth, in sound, in faith. He looked at his hands, calloused, simple, human. They trembled not with fear but with awe. "I am no king," he whispered. "No prophet. Just a shepherd." The flame flickered. The wind replied, "Every kingdom begins with a shepherd." He thought of the heavens, of that place beyond stars where silence holds its breath, and wondered if they remembered him. The thought filled him with both peace and ache, for somewhere in that boundless expanse slept the song he was born to carry. In another realm, beyond the fabric of time, the watchers stood in stillness, their eyes fixed upon him. One spoke softly, "The note has returned to the measure." Another answered, "Then the world shall remember its harmony." And far beneath them, in the molten silence of the forge that needs no hands, the song that would become the sword of David pulsed once more. The vibration rippled through light and space, through eons and elements, until it brushed the surface of the earth and found its echo in the boy's heart. The connection was sealed. Heaven had chosen its vessel, not through lineage or might, but through listening. The boy who could hear the silence would one day wield the sound. And so the first covenant between steel and soul was written, not in ink, nor in scripture, but in vibration. A song, hidden inside the world, waiting for the right breath to awaken it. David rose and looked toward the horizon, where the first rays of morning burned through the veil of night. The light stretched across the fields, touching every living thing as though blessing it. He felt it on his face and smiled faintly. Somewhere deep within, he heard it again, the hum beneath all things, and for a moment he almost believed the light itself was singing. He gathered his harp, walked down from the hill, and vanished into the day. Behind him, the wind carried the faintest melody, half forgotten, half divine. It moved through the trees, into the stones, across the waters, and down into the waiting heart of the world where the sword still dreamed. The song would sleep again for a time, as all holy things do. But its promise lingered, shimmering beneath the pulse of creation, waiting for the shepherd to become the singer, and the singer to become the king. And in the forge beyond stars, the blade stirred once more, humming quietly to itself, as though whispering, "Soon." The boy had grown, though he still walked the same hills, still watched the same stars. The world around him moved as though caught between two breaths, one divine, one human. In the still hours before dawn, when mist curled over the grass and the sheep slept like stones, he would wake and feel it, the same silent hum that once sang through his bones. But now it was quieter, heavier, as though waiting for something to begin again. He no longer played his harp for the joy of it. Each note felt like prayer, each chord like confession. His songs had deepened with the ache of growing, the ache of knowing that something vast was following him, unseen but constant. The shepherd's path had always been lonely, but lately the solitude had changed. He began to sense eyes in the silence, not the eyes of beasts nor of men, but of heaven itself watching through the veil. One evening the sky dimmed early. Clouds gathered without wind, and a lightless calm settled over the fields. David stood still, his heart tightening in his chest. The sheep grew restless. The air thickened, metallic and strange, as though the very world was holding its breath. Then, without sound, the clouds opened in flame, not red or gold, but a white fire that did not burn. It fell in ribbons, spiraling like breath made visible. He dropped to his knees. The ground trembled beneath him. The fire did not consume, it circled him, alive and aware, whispering through heat that did not scorch. The shepherd heard no voice, yet he understood. The flame was not from this earth. It was the same that once lit the forge before time began. The fire spoke without words, through vibration that shook his bones. It showed him visions, the hall of light where sound became steel, the watchers bowing before a song they could not master, the spark that had slept since creation's dawn. It showed him the blade unborn, waiting in the silence between worlds. Then came a knowing that was more felt than heard. You were there when it sang first. You are the echo made flesh. Tears burned his cheeks. He whispered, "But I am nothing." And the flame replied, "That is why you are chosen." It was not command nor flattery, it was truth, pure and unyielding. The divine never sought power, only obedience. And so, before that sacred light, David bowed his head and let go of every song he thought he had written. He gave them back to the source. When he opened his eyes, the fire was gone. Only the scent of air remained, clean, metallic, alive. He looked to his harp, and its strings shimmered faintly, as though remembering the touch of heaven. He touched them, and a single tone rang out, clear, steady, eternal. It hung in the air long after the sound should have died, like a bridge between seen and unseen. From that moment the flame began to follow him. It was not visible to eyes, but it lived in the rhythm of his pulse. When he prayed, it stirred. When he played, it listened. When he slept, it whispered to his dreams. And through it all, the forge beyond stars stirred again. For the connection between heaven and earth had been renewed through the shepherd's surrender. The next day he walked to the edge of the field where the hills met the horizon. The sky shimmered faintly as though breathing. He lifted his gaze and whispered, "If this is real, let me not break beneath it." And the wind answered with a warmth that wrapped around him like unseen hands. "Faith does not break, child. It bends and sings." That night when he lay upon the grass, the stars burned lower than ever before, not distant, but near, as though bending down to watch the flame that now lived inside him. The heavens knew what he did not, that the blade was already being forged, not in iron, but in devotion. And the boy who had once played to the sheep was now playing for the forge of creation itself. The flame had chosen its heart. The melody had found its vessel. The shepherd's quiet life had begun to glow from within, carrying the hum of something eternal, the fire that remembers sound, the sound that remembers God. Days passed, though David no longer marked them by the sun. He lived now between moments, half in the world of stone and hunger, half in the world of sound and flame. At times he wondered if he was losing his mind, but then the wind would move and the whisper would return, gentle and unbroken. "You are being tempered, as all blades must be." He did not yet know what that meant, but he began to feel it, the slow, quiet shaping of his spirit. Each hardship, each night alone among the stars, felt like the strike of a hammer on unseen metal. The shepherd's life was the forge, and his heart the anvil. Every test that pressed against him only deepened the music within. The flame, unseen by others, began to move through his world. It lingered at the edges of his waking sight, a warmth behind his thoughts, a pulse in the ground beneath his feet. When he walked through rain, the droplets hissed softly as though remembering fire. When he prayed, the silence around him glowed. One morning he awoke to the cry of a lion among his flock. The beast's roar tore through the dawn, shaking the very air. The sheep scattered and the young shepherd ran without thinking, only faith guiding his feet. He carried no weapon, no armor, only a sling and his breath. Yet as he ran, the hum returned, low, deep, alive. Time seemed to slow. The world fell away until only rhythm remained, the beat of his heart, the echo of the flame, the pulse of the earth beneath him. He felt no fear. When he lifted the stone, it did not feel like stone, it felt like a note. When he swung the sling, it did not feel like motion, it felt like song. The stone struck true. The lion fell silent. The world stilled. He stood trembling, not with triumph, but with awe. The flame within him surged not in violence, but in sorrow. It whispered not for death, but for deliverance. And he understood. The act had not been of war, but of alignment. He had not killed, he had restored balance. For even in that moment of danger, the fire within him had not burned for victory, but for harmony. He knelt beside the fallen beast, his hand trembling over its mane. "Forgive me," he whispered, and the words were not his own. They came from somewhere far beyond him, carried through him like music through hollow wood. For he now knew what few ever learn, that even holy power must grieve when it moves through flesh. When he rose, the dawn was different. The air shimmered with warmth, and the sheep gathered near as though drawn by the same unseen peace. The world itself seemed to breathe easier. From that day, word of him began to spread. People spoke of the shepherd whose courage was not born of strength, but of strange calm, whose gaze seemed older than his years, whose hands could still the trembling of beasts. Some whispered that angels walked with him. Others said his harp could charm fire, but David knew none of it was his. The flame was not his to command. It was borrowed light entrusted to him for purpose still hidden. At night, when the stars leaned low, he would ask softly, "Why me?" And always the same answer would come, through silence that hummed like far-off thunder, "Because you listen." He began to understand that listening was not weakness. It was the forge. To listen was to surrender to rhythm older than time, to let the world speak first and then answer in kind. The fire within him did not roar. It pulsed quietly, waiting for the moment when heaven would call it to shape. Sometimes, when the night deepened and his breath slowed near sleep, he saw it again. A faint blade of light, hovering in the dark, not yet solid, not yet ready, but nearer than before. And when he reached for it, it would dissolve back into the hum of air, whispering, "Not yet." The flame must learn patience. He would wake with tears on his face, the sound still lingering in his chest. And though he could not name it, he knew the forging had begun. The fire within him did not fade, it deepened. It became a rhythm in his breath, a quiet awareness that followed him even as he laughed, even as he worked. The hills were no longer only hills, they were altars. The sky above him no longer only blue, it was a veil of waiting light. David had begun to live between two worlds, and though no one saw it, heaven watched his every step. One evening, as the sun bled into gold, he wandered farther than usual. The air smelled of rain and dust, that ancient perfume of creation reborn. He climbed a ridge where the grass shimmered silver in the dying light. And there, in the open stillness, the flame revealed itself again. Not as fire this time, but as presence, a brightness without form. It filled the air around him, and for a heartbeat he felt weightless, as though his bones were made of light. The voice came not from above, but from within, "You are almost ready to remember." He fell to his knees, his heart pounding. "Remember what?" he whispered. The answer came softly, like wind over water, the covenant between sound and soul, the fire that listens to the singer, the blade that breathes with the believer. Images rippled through him, not visions of the future, but memories older than the earth. He saw the forge again, burning in the dark before dawn. He saw the watchers, silent and trembling before a song too holy for language. And he saw the flame bending toward a shadow of form, as though yearning to become more than sound. Then the images faded, and only one remained, his own reflection upon the surface of unseen light. In that reflection, his eyes were not his own. They glowed with the memory of the forge. The divine was showing him what he was made of, not dust, but resonance. Tears filled his eyes, for he realized what this meant, that all souls are forged from the same sacred breath, that every life, however humble, carries a spark of that first sound, the one that shaped the stars. The flame had not come to grant him power. It had come to remind him of what he already was. When he rose, the air itself seemed to hum. He felt it under his skin, in the pulse of his throat, in the space behind his eyes. Everything he touched, even the stones beneath his feet, vibrated faintly, alive with quiet awareness. The whole world, he realized, was made of listening. For days he could not speak. Words felt too crude for what he now carried. When others greeted him, he only smiled, and the silence that followed seemed to comfort them, though they did not know why. The sheep stayed near him always, sensing the calm that moved through his body like music through water. At night he played again, but his harp no longer sang for joy alone. It had become an altar. The notes that left it were not his, they were prayers returning home. Each tone glowed with the memory of that unseen forge, and though his hands trembled, he played until the stars seemed to sway above him, as if listening in reverence. And then on one of those nights when the moon hung low and full over the hills, the flame moved once more. It rose unseen, coiling through the wind, invisible but felt, and this time it spoke through the sound of his own music. When sound becomes surrender, creation begins again. David stopped playing. The strings still trembled, echoing that final chord. The meaning settled deep within him. He understood now. The sword he was destined to wield would not be born from battle or blood. It would be born from surrender, from music so pure that even heaven would pause to listen. He placed his harp beside him, hands resting upon his knees, and whispered into the stillness, "Then let me be the silence that listens." The flame flickered softly within his chest, steady as a heartbeat. The world around him glowed with quiet approval, and high above, where the angels keep their watch, the forge stirred again, brightening with every breath he took. The shepherd had become the fire's keeper, not of its power, but of its peace. There are moments in every divine story when the unseen decides to take form, when the eternal, weary of waiting, bends close enough to touch the dust. David had reached such a moment. The line between his song and heaven's silence had thinned to almost nothing. Even the wind around him seemed to follow the rhythm of his breath. He did not know that angels walked with him now, hidden in the shimmer of light, veiled by stillness. They followed his songs as if tracing the memory of their own beginnings. For every time he played, creation itself remembered what it meant to be pure. The flame within him was no longer a visitor. It had become a companion, glowing in his chest like a secret covenant between man and maker. But before any covenant can be fulfilled, it must be tested. One night the shepherd's peace was broken. He returned to his hill to find the flock scattered, their tracks leading toward the edge of the forest where darkness lived like breath itself. The sky above it pulsed with a faint red shimmer, as if some unseen furnace had opened its mouth. The air smelled of iron and smoke, the scent of defiance. Fear rose in him, but so did the hum, that familiar vibration that steadied his shaking hands. He followed the tracks, each step lit faintly by a warmth that seemed to come from nowhere. The trees ahead loomed high, their branches twisting like hands reaching toward the stars. Shadows moved among them, shapes that belonged to no beast he knew. The whispers came first, low, mocking, serpentine. "The fire follows you, little shepherd," they hissed from between the leaves. "But you cannot carry what was meant for angels." He stopped, his heart pounding, yet his spirit did not waver. The warmth inside him flared. The forest brightened as though stars had fallen into its boughs. He lifted his voice, trembling but firm. The fire was not given to own, but to remember. The shadows recoiled, hissing. Their edges melted back into mist. For the first time, David saw what they were: fragments of the fallen flame, remnants of those who had once stood in heaven's forge but turned their light toward pride. They were echoes of the same fire that now lived within him, but twisted, lost, hungry. "Why you?" they whispered again, circling him. "Why does the fire answer the dirt-born when we who shone before you are forgotten?" He felt pity before fear. "Because I do not seek to hold it," he said softly. "I only seek to listen." The forest shook. The shadows screamed not in rage but in agony, for the truth burned sharper than any blade. In that instant the light within him rose in a single soundless burst, a pure tone born from silence, humming with the resonance of the forge. The air cracked open. The trees bowed. The whispers fell away like dust, and then there was stillness. The flame around him dimmed, folding back into his heart. He fell to his knees, exhausted, his breath trembling. Above him the sky cleared and the stars blinked awake, countless eyes of heaven, watching with quiet joy. The shepherd had faced not an enemy but a reflection, the same fire that once fell from grace, now purified through surrender. The wind whispered through the trees once more, gentler now, and in it he heard the voice that had guided him since boyhood. "Every light must descend before it can rise. You have carried the fire through the valley. The forge is ready." He bowed his head. His tears fell to the soil, steaming faintly where they touched, as if kissed by warmth from beneath the earth. The air trembled. Somewhere deep below, in that hidden realm between sound and silence, the first metal began to awaken. The forge that had waited since the dawn of creation stirred again, this time not in heaven but within the heart of man. When David opened his eyes, the forest was calm. The stars above burned steady. The sheep returned from the shadows, their eyes reflecting the same quiet peace. He rose slowly, breathing the night as though tasting the beginning of something sacred. He knew now that the flame had not been sent to find him, it had been sent to learn through him. For only through weakness could it remember mercy. Only through flesh could it remember love. The shepherd turned back toward the hills, and behind him the faint glow of the hidden forge flickered through the trees, the first light of what would one day become the sword of David. And the heavens whispered in reply, "So it begins." The nights grew quieter after that, as though even the stars were holding their breath. The flame that once danced around David now burned within him, gentler, steadier, wiser. He had seen what no mortal was meant to see, and though he walked again among men, part of him no longer belonged to the world. The fields, the wind, the sheep, all felt different now, charged with a soft pulse of remembrance. He rose before dawn as he always had, but now his every motion carried reverence. The dew on the grass shimmered like tears. The morning light felt like the breath of an unseen forge. Each step he took hummed faintly beneath him, as if the earth itself were alive with unseen music. He knew then that the fire had not left, it had merely become quieter, waiting for its next command. One morning, as mist rolled across the plain, he heard footsteps, not the tread of shepherds or soldiers, but of destiny itself. Out of the haze came the prophet Samuel, his face marked with the calm of one who carries messages from heaven. He walked slowly, his hand gripping a small horn filled with oil not for battle, but for anointing. His eyes met David's, and the younger man felt time stop. "Do not be afraid," said the prophet, his voice trembling with both burden and awe. "The Lord has sought a heart that listens more than it speaks. You are that heart." David fell to his knees. He had dreamt of this moment but never dared believe it would come. Samuel uncorked the horn, and the scent of oil filled the air, sweet, ancient, radiant, like the perfume of the first gardens. He poured it slowly upon David's head, and as it ran down his hair and into the soil, the ground itself seemed to breathe. For the flame that had slept beneath the world stirred again. The oil glowed faintly upon his skin. To Samuel's eyes it was light, to heaven's eyes it was alignment. The moment the first drop touched him, the forge that had waited since the dawn of sound awakened fully. The anointing was not mere ritual, it was ignition. Through the prophet's trembling hands, heaven anointed not a man but a vessel. As the oil fell, it mingled with the unseen fire within him, and something immense passed through his body like thunder given shape, like light finding its echo. His heart burned, but not with pain. It was remembrance. He saw again the halls of the watchers, the sound before steel, the whisper that had followed him through every breath. Now all of it converged. The voice returned not as a whisper but as certainty. The time of sound has ended. The time of form begins. David trembled. He understood now that faith itself was a forge, and obedience the fire that gave it shape. He was no longer merely a shepherd, he was becoming an instrument. The melody that had waited since the first dawn was about to take form not as a song but as a blade. The oil sank into his skin like memory returning home. Samuel watched in silence, his eyes wide with wonder. When the final drop fell, the prophet whispered, "The Lord has chosen you." But David heard a deeper truth beneath it. The forge had chosen him too. For heaven does not anoint with oil alone, it anoints with purpose. When Samuel departed, the boy stood alone beneath the rising sun. The air shimmered faintly, and for the first time he saw it, a shape flickering in the light before him. It was faint, almost invisible, a suggestion of a sword made of flame and breath. It hovered for a moment, humming softly like a song half remembered. Then it faded, leaving only warmth upon the wind. David closed his eyes. He knew what it meant. The fire that had once been sound was now descending into matter. The unseen was learning to wear form. The forge of heaven was preparing its masterpiece. He whispered into the empty field, "I am ready." The ground beneath him trembled, not violently but reverently. The hum deepened, spreading outward, as though creation itself acknowledged the covenant. From that moment on, the air around him was never still. The world itself had begun to shift, to reforge, to listen. And somewhere, deep beneath time, the first sparks touched metal. The sword of David had begun to take shape not by hammer, not by hand, but by the obedience of a heart aflame. When the prophet's shadow faded over the horizon, silence lingered in its place, a silence too vast to be empty. David stood for a long while, still as a stone, the oil cooling upon his brow, the earth beneath him faintly humming as though alive. He could not explain it, but the moment felt eternal, as if heaven had paused to let creation listen. Somewhere in the distance, thunder murmured, low and patient, not from storm but from remembrance. He looked toward the sky. The clouds moved slowly, their undersides shimmering faintly with gold, like embers hidden behind silk. The boy who had once played for sheep felt now as though he played for stars. He touched his chest, his heart still burned, but softly, as though the flame within had taken root. That night he dreamt of the forge, not the one of earth, blackened with soot and smoke, but the one of heaven, vast, radiant, alive. He saw the watchers again, silent and bowed, surrounding the great anvil that floated in light. Above it hovered the song, the same tone that had followed him since boyhood, now solidifying, gathering shape. The music had become matter, and the matter glowed with the breath of God. In the dream, a voice spoke, neither male nor female, but infinite. The sound you carry is not yours. It is the seed of creation reborn. When the blade awakens, the world will remember its measure. David watched as the tone folded into itself, rippling like molten light. It cooled into a narrow arc, bright, sharp, weightless, and yet, when he looked upon it, he saw not weapon but reflection. In its surface, he saw his own face, first as a boy, then as a man, then as something beyond man, light wrapped in dust. The blade pulsed once, and the dream dissolved into silence. He awoke before dawn, his skin damp with sweat, his breath trembling. The fire within him felt stronger, heavier, almost unbearable. He walked outside, the sky pale with early light, and fell to his knees. "I am not worthy," he whispered. "I am small and afraid and only flesh." The wind stirred the trees and replied with a sound that was both breeze and voice. Iron is made worthy by fire. He bowed his head. He finally understood. The purpose of suffering, the weight of loneliness, the ache of faith, it was all the tempering of metal not yet cooled. Each doubt, each wound, each prayer that went unanswered, all were hammers shaping the unseen. He rose and looked to the horizon. The hills seemed sharper now, the light deeper, the world more awake. Every sound, a bird's call, a distant stream, even his own heartbeat carried rhythm. The music of creation had returned, no longer only around him but through him. He was the harp now, and the strings that vibrated were his very veins. That evening he took his harp again and began to play, not for the sheep, not even for himself, but for the forge that waited in silence. Each note became a spark, each chord a breath of fire. The sound shimmered into the air unseen, rising like incense toward heaven. Somewhere beyond the veil in the hall of divine metal, the flame answered. Stars flickered above him like molten droplets of the first fire. The earth beneath him warmed faintly. His fingers, though trembling, found new strength. He played until tears blurred his sight, and when his voice joined the song, it was not his alone. The tone that once shaped the heavens sang through him, bending time into worship. And in that moment, for the first time since creation's dawn, heaven and earth sang the same song. When the final note faded, he sat still, shaking. The harp in his lap was warm, glowing faintly. He touched the strings, and they hummed softly on their own, resonating with something beyond mortal reach. He knew then that the anointing was complete. The flame within had become one with the forge beyond. The invisible blade had found its music, and the heavens had begun to shape its edge. David lifted his eyes toward the stars, his voice a whisper barely heard by the wind. "Then let my heart be iron, let it bear the weight of your sound." And somewhere in eternity the fire answered not in words but in the steady, ringing hum of creation reborn. The forging had begun. The dream returned to him often in the nights that followed, each time clearer than before. The anvil of light, the tone that turned to flame, the shape that waited to be born, all lingered at the edges of his waking life. He would walk among his sheep and suddenly feel the heat of the forge upon his skin, though the air was cool. He would drink from the river and taste iron, though the water was sweet. The boundaries between vision and world were thinning, like silk stretched to transparency. David began to notice patterns. When he sang the psalms that rose from within him, songs he did not write but merely received, the ground beneath him seemed to thrum faintly. When he prayed, the light around him bent as if listening. And sometimes, when silence fell too heavily, he could almost hear the distant hammering, slow, deliberate, endless. The sound of the divine shaping itself through time. He came to understand that the sword was not being made apart from him, it was being made through him. The divine forge was not in the heavens, but in the beating furnace of his own heart. Each trial, each tear, each act of faith was a stroke of the hammer. Every act of mercy cooled the metal. Every temptation resisted, refined its edge. But the making of holy things requires both fire and fracture. One evening, while the sun bled low and red across the fields, a messenger came running, dust clinging to his hair, breath sharp with fear. "The king calls for you," he gasped. "Saul, son of Kish. He has heard of your songs, that they calm the troubled spirit within him." David's heart faltered. He had never stood before a throne, never played for royalty. Yet something deep inside him whispered, "Go, the forge awaits its next flame." He went with the messenger. The journey was long, winding through barren valleys and whispering trees. By the time they reached the city, the moon had risen, and torches burned like small suns along the palace walls. The scent of iron and incense filled the air, a reminder that even kings are bound by the same elements as shepherds. When he entered the hall, Saul sat hunched upon his throne, his crown tilted like a weary burden. His eyes were wild, haunted by shadows unseen. "Play," the king commanded. "Let the voices that torment me be stilled." David bowed low and lifted his harp. The moment his fingers touched the strings, the air shifted. The flame within him rose like dawn. The first note rang out soft, trembling, pure. It moved through the chamber like wind through wheat, touching walls, torches, men's hearts alike. Saul's eyes closed. The tension in his face softened. The darkness that clung to him began to retreat inch by inch, as though drawn back into the depths from which it came. Courtiers stood still, afraid to breathe, for they felt something holy pass through them, not power but peace. And as David played, he felt it too, the same hum that had followed him from the fields, the same tone that had lived in his blood since boyhood. The sword was singing again, but not in battle. It was singing through healing. When the song ended, the silence that followed was deeper than before. Saul opened his eyes, tears glistening there. "What have you done to me?" he whispered. David bowed. "Nothing, my lord. I have only reminded the heir to listen." The king stared at him a long time. Then he said softly, "Stay. When you play, I remember peace." And so the shepherd became the king's musician, a servant whose weapon was song, whose armor was stillness. But in the unseen realm, something more was happening. Each time David played, the flame within him grew stronger. The tone that shaped worlds was learning the rhythm of human hands. The forge was no longer waiting, it was working. That night, when all had gone to sleep, David stood alone on the palace balcony. The city lights below flickered like distant embers. Above him, the stars pulsed in rhythm with his heart. He whispered into the night, "Let my music be the hammer, my breath the fire, my soul the metal you shape." And in that sacred darkness, the air itself answered with a hum so deep, it seemed the world was breathing with him. The blade was not yet finished, but its edge was beginning to gleam. The nights inside the palace were unlike those of the hills. Gone was the endless wind, the solitude of stars, the scent of rain over open earth. Here the air was thick with oil and gold, with the hum of power and fear. Yet even in the marble silence of the court, David could hear it, the faint ringing beneath the world, the steady hammer of heaven's forge. Each day he spent in Saul's service, he felt that unseen rhythm grow closer, like a tide rising beneath his feet. When the king's spirit grew dark, David played. The harp's voice flowed through the halls like a river of glass. The soldiers outside lowered their torches when they heard it. Even the birds that nested in the eaves fell silent, listening. Saul would sit with his head in his hands, the shadow leaving his face little by little, until the fire in his eyes softened to human light again. Yet David knew that peace came not from him but through him. The flame that had chosen him was now singing through his hands. At times he wondered if Saul heard what he heard, the deeper tone beneath the music, the whisper that lingered in each chord. For to David, every note carried memory, the fields, the fire, the anointing. And within the sound he felt the slow shaping of something divine, not a weapon yet, but a promise hardening into form. One evening, after the king's sleep had found him, David wandered to the edge of the courtyard. The moon hung low and full, casting silver across the stones. He knelt beside the fountain, and the water's surface shimmered like polished metal. For a moment he saw something within it, not his face, but a blade of light, flickering and alive. He reached out, but the image broke. The ripples spread outward, and the reflection was gone. He bowed his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "I will wait until you call it from the flame." A wind moved through the court, soft but sure, and with it came a whisper, "Iron remembers who first breathed it." He closed his eyes. He understood. Every element, every fragment of matter that would one day form the sword already existed in the world, scattered in the stones, sleeping in the soil, waiting in silence for the word to awaken it. The anointing had not only chosen him, it had chosen all creation around him to participate in the making. Weeks passed. The boy became a man. His songs filled the chambers of the palace and the caverns of the people's hearts. They sang his words in the markets, in the vineyards, by the wells. Even those who had never seen him felt the peace that his melodies carried. And still the forge burned on in secret. But heaven forges through pressure. The fire that blesses also tests. One night, as David played, Saul's gaze turned cold. The shadow that haunted him returned, darker than before. His hand gripped the spear beside his throne. David's music did not falter, but the air grew sharp, the hum of peace shifting to warning. The king rose suddenly, his face twisted by something unseen, and hurled the spear toward the boy who had healed him. The weapon struck the pillar beside David's head, shattering stone. For a moment time froze. The harp still trembled in his hands. Then, without anger, without fear, David lowered it and bowed. "The flame protects not against death, but against hate," he whispered to himself. And though his heart raced, his spirit remained still. He left the palace that night, carrying only his harp and the faint warmth that still glowed inside him. The moon guided his steps back toward the wilderness. He did not curse the king nor question heaven. He only listened, for the forge was still working. When he reached the edge of the desert, he turned and looked back once. The city burned faintly in the distance, gold against blackness. He could feel the song still vibrating behind its walls, now tempered by trial. He smiled, though his eyes filled with tears. "The anointing is not the crown," he said softly. "It is the fire that teaches how to bear one." He knelt upon the sand, lifted his face to the stars, and breathed deeply. The air shimmered around him, alive once more with that first music, the hum that began before all things. And as he closed his eyes, the wind carried the voice of heaven through the night. "The iron has been anointed. Soon it shall remember its form." Far beyond the reach of mortal vision, deep in the silent heart of creation, a single spark touched metal. The sword of David quivered, its edge awakening, its song preparing to meet the hand it had waited for since the first light was born. The hills were still dark when David rose, the horizon a faint line of gold hidden beneath mist. The wilderness had become his home once more, but it no longer felt empty. Every wind that moved through the valley carried memory. Every shadow seemed to whisper of purpose not yet revealed. The fire that had been anointed within him burned quietly, patient now, no longer the flame of calling but of readiness. He moved like one who had listened to mountains. The harp still hung across his back, its strings faintly humming even in silence, as though the world itself played through it. And within his heart the same resonance waited, that steady, unending hum that once shaped the forge of heaven. It no longer frightened him. It guided him. In the distance he heard a different sound, drums, faint but approaching. The air itself seemed to tighten around it. He walked toward the ridge and saw below a sea of tents, the gathering of Israel's army. Beyond the valley, on the opposite slope, another host, the Philistines, their banners like waves of iron. Between them stretched emptiness, heavy with the tension of fear. Then the voice, deep, mocking, cruel, rolled like thunder across the space between. The giant Goliath, his armor flashing in the sun that now crept above the hills. "Send me a man," he cried, "that we may fight and let the gods decide." His laughter struck the ground like lightning. Even from afar, David felt its weight, the shadow of arrogance that had once darkened the watchers themselves. He descended toward the camp. Men turned and stared. Some recognized the musician who had once soothed the king. "What brings you here, shepherd?" they asked. He only smiled faintly. "A song unfinished," he said. Saul sat among his captains, the crown heavy upon his brow, his eyes dimmed by fear. When he saw David approach, his heart trembled, not with anger this time, but confusion. "You again," he murmured. "Why are you here?" "To finish the note you began," David replied softly. "The fire that soothed you will now stand for you." The king shook his head. "You are a boy, he is a mountain." David's voice was calm. "God is the wind that shapes the mountain." For a moment, silence. Then Saul gestured to his armor-bearers. "Then take my sword, my armor, my shield." But when they placed them upon him, David could not move. The metal was heavy with fear, not faith. He removed it and laid it down. "These were made for defense," he said. "The weapon that waits for me was made for truth." He turned toward the valley, taking only his sling and 5 smooth stones from the stream that whispered nearby. Yet as his hand touched the water, something happened, a vibration deep within the earth, a hum like a voice half hidden in the current. The stones shimmered faintly in his palm. He knew then that this was no ordinary river. It was the same river that once flowed through Eden, the one that remembered the first sound. The air around him brightened. He felt the flames stir within, rising through his veins until his breath glowed. His sling was no longer a weapon, it was an instrument. The motion of his hand, a rhythm. The stone in his palm, a note waiting to be sung. He stepped into the valley. Each footfall echoed like the heartbeat of the world. The soldiers on both sides held their breath, sensing that something beyond war was unfolding. Goliath roared his challenge again, his voice shaking the air. But David did not answer with words. He answered with silence. A silence so complete it drew heaven's gaze. The flame inside him rose, and the unseen forge awakened once more, this time not in dream but in flesh. The boy looked up toward the sky, and for a heartbeat the clouds above him split in light. He felt the tone return, the first tone, the one from before creation, vibrating now through his arms, his breath, his being. He lifted the sling, and the world waited. The stone spun through the air, not thrown but released, propelled by faith that remembered its source. The hum became thunder, the air itself turned to song. When the stone struck, it was not stone at all, but sound returning home. The giant fell. Silence followed, vast, holy, unending. Even the birds ceased their flight. And in that stillness, for the first time since the dawn of man, the heavens heard their own song played back to them through mortal hands. The echo of the fall rolled through the valley like thunder that had lost its rage. For a long moment the army stood frozen, two seas of men divided by silence. Then came the wind. It swept across the plain in one great breath, lifting dust and memory together, carrying away the sound of the giant's pride and replacing it with something older, purer. It was the hum that had followed David all his life, the note of creation, the pulse of the forge, the sigh of heaven through mortal air. He lowered his sling. His hand trembled, not from fear but from the weight of what had passed through him. The flame within his chest had grown still, as though it too were bowing in reverence. Around him the air shimmered with heat, though there was no fire. Every grain of sand seemed alive, whispering the same wordless song, remember. The soldiers of Israel surged forward then, shouting victory, their cries breaking the spell. But David did not join them. He stood where the giant had fallen, the sling still hanging loosely in his fingers, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sun climbed higher, bright and terrible, and for a moment he thought he saw beyond it, beyond sky, beyond time, into the place where all sound is born. He saw the forge again, its light pulsing like a heart, and within it the sword not yet finished, but gleaming with recognition. He knelt beside Goliath's fallen form. The giant's eyes were open, reflecting the sky clouds drifting across the still mirror of death. David whispered, "You are not my enemy. You were the shadow that taught the light to rise." He reached for the giant's sword, vast, heavy, forged for hands larger than any man, and the moment he touched it, the air changed. A vibration rippled through the blade, deep and resonant, as if something sleeping within the metal had been waiting for this touch. The sword was not just steel. It was memory. It carried the echo of the same celestial fire that had once shaped the stars. But unlike the holy flame, it had been bent toward conquest, tuned to the music of domination rather than harmony. David felt the difference, the dissonance between heaven's song and man's ambition. The weight of it burned through his arms. He lifted the sword high, and in that moment light blazed across its surface as though heaven itself was watching. He did not claim it. He did not raise it in triumph. Instead he bowed, and with reverent calm he spoke aloud. "Let this blade remember peace." He drove it into the ground beside the fallen warrior. The earth accepted it like an offering. A low hum spread outward, felt more than heard. The ground trembled, but gently, as if sighing in relief. The soldiers behind him stopped their cries. Some dropped to their knees, sensing holiness. Even the Philistines who fled turned back once, their faces pale with something deeper than fear. They had witnessed more than defeat, they had seen faith become fire. David turned away. His heart was quiet now. The battle was over, but something greater had begun. He walked back through the field as the armies surged behind him, his feet leaving faint impressions that glowed for a heartbeat before fading. When he reached the stream where he had chosen his stones, he knelt again and washed his hands. The water shimmered, golden in the afternoon light. The same hum he had felt before the battle now filled the air around him, stronger, deeper, pulsing with joy. He realized then that the battle had never been about strength or skill. It had been a test of alignment, of sound, faith, and will. Heaven had not intervened for him. It had sung through him. The first song of battle was not war, it was restoration. It was creation remembering its own rhythm through the courage of one who listened. As he rose, he saw movement in the water, a faint image, not of the slain giant, but of a blade made of light. It was there only for an instant, yet it filled him with peace. The sword had not yet entered the world, but its song had found its voice. David walked on, the wind behind him whispering through the valley that had once trembled with fear. Every step felt lighter, every breath like the first breath of dawn. And high above, in the forge beyond stars, the sound of hammer and flame resumed, slow, rhythmic, holy. The sword of David was still being made, and now its edge had learned mercy. That night, the valley where giants had fallen slept beneath a sky washed clean. No cries of victory remained, only the whisper of wind through broken armor and the low murmur of rivers carrying dust away. David sat upon a rock overlooking the field, his harp resting beside him. The moonlight poured over the land like silver water, and the silence felt alive, not empty, but waiting. He had seen death, but not in the way men speak of it. What he had witnessed was transformation. Pride turned to dust, fear to faith, flesh to memory. He had seen how creation absorbs all things, how even destruction can be retuned to harmony if one's heart listens deeply enough. And now, as he gazed into the shadows, he understood that the battle had not truly ended, it had only changed form. For war does not end when swords are lowered. It ends when the heart itself lays down its need for conquest. He drew his harp closer and touched the strings. The tone that rose was soft, sorrowful, but beautiful, a requiem not for a man, but for the violence that had birthed him. The melody moved through the valley like the last light of day, brushing the fallen helmets, the discarded shields, the torn banners. The air itself began to glow faintly as though listening. The wind shifted, and David felt the presence again, not the fire this time, but the forge's warmth, steady and near. It moved around him like breath. When he closed his eyes, he saw the great anvil once more, glowing in endless light. But now something new. A shadow stood before it, his own. He realized then that the sword was no longer only being forged for him. It was being forged through him, shaped by every act of faith, every moment of surrender, every sound he drew from the silence. Each note he played became a strike upon the metal of heaven, each prayer a drop of oil upon its surface. The sword was not a thing. It was the music of his obedience made form. He stopped playing, the last note fading into the night. The stars above him pulsed brighter, flickering in rhythm. He lifted his eyes to them and whispered, "If the sword is born of sound, let my life be its song." A soft radiance fell upon him then, not light but awareness. The forge beyond the stars and the soul within his chest were one and the same. He felt it as truth, not knowledge. Heaven was not elsewhere. It was here, in every breath that loved enough to listen. The air thickened. The ground beneath him trembled gently. The harp in his hands began to hum, unplayed, alive. He looked down, the strings shimmered with faint fire, and a tone deeper than any he'd ever known filled the space around him. It was not music, it was declaration. The voice of the forge spoke again, but now it sounded through him, not to him. When faith becomes sound and sound becomes form, the blade shall sing. The vibration deepened, spreading through the rocks, the grass, the very air. Across the valley, distant torches flickered, their flames bending toward him as if bowing. He did not understand it fully, but he did not need to. Some truths do not need words, they are absorbed by being. He stood and looked to the east, where dawn's faint blush touched the rim of the world. He felt no triumph, no pride, only peace. He whispered a prayer for those who had fallen, both friend and foe. May the silence carry them home. Then he turned, and in the last breath before sunrise he saw it for only a heartbeat, the sword of David, not yet of iron, not yet of earth, but of light, floating before him like a thought remembered by God. It gleamed softly, breathing, singing without sound. He reached toward it. His fingers brushed its radiance, and warmth spread through him, a warmth that felt like understanding. The blade pulsed once, then vanished, leaving only its hum inside his chest. He smiled. "Then I am the scabbard," he said softly, "and the song waits to be unsheathed." As dawn broke, its light fell over him like blessing. The first rays touched his face, and in that golden quiet, heaven whispered through the wind, "The sword is not made for war, but for witness." Let the world learn through you what peace sounds like when it remembers its maker. And so the first song of battle ended not with victory, but with vow. When the morning came, the valley was washed in light so soft that even the broken armor gleamed like dew. The air smelled of iron and wildflowers, of death and rebirth together, sharing the same breath. David walked among the remnants, his sandals brushing over soil still warm with the echo of thunder. The wind followed him as it always had, whispering through bent spears and shattered shields like a choir of sighs. He did not flinch at the sight of ruin, for he had come to see battle as the earth's strange way of remembering balance. He stopped where the river bent around a cluster of stones, where his sling had first sung its defiance. The water here ran clear again, washing blood from the rocks until they shone pale and innocent. He knelt, scooped the river into his palms, and let it pour back through his fingers. "All things return," he murmured, "even sound." In the reflection of that water he saw not a warrior but a servant, a vessel that light had borrowed for a time. The fire within him glowed low now, not fierce but steady, as if satisfied with what had been learned. He understood something in that stillness, that faith was not the shield that protects from pain, but the hand that shapes it into meaning. Every scar, every fear, every trembling, all were hammer strikes against the metal of the soul. The sword was being tempered, not in the forge above, but within his own surrender. He rose and walked back through the field. The bodies of soldiers lay where they had fallen, their faces turned toward the sky. He covered them gently with cloaks and cloaked them again in silence. It was not victory he felt, it was mercy. He saw now that even the fallen were part of the song, each one a note in the long, slow hymn of creation returning to itself. As he moved, he began to hum. The melody was simple, a shepherd's tune, old as dust, but as he sang, the world seemed to shift around him. The air grew bright, almost translucent. The grass straightened. The birds returned, their wings slicing gold through the morning. And in that gentle rising of life from death, the valley itself seemed to breathe again. He could feel heaven's attention upon him, not as gaze, but as nearness. The forge was awake. The anvil rang softly in the unseen deep. The hum within his chest answered it, note for note. He understood that what had happened here was not merely a battle of men, but a harmony restored. The sound of creation, lost for ages, had found its echo in the human heart once more. He lifted his eyes toward the ridges and saw Samuel there, or perhaps only the memory of him, his robe a whisper in the wind. "You have done what was required," the prophet's voice came faintly, as if carried through years instead of air. "But remember, David, even divine fire must rest between tempers. Peace is the cooling that keeps the blade from breaking." David bowed his head. He knew now that the greatest test was not the battle, but the calm that followed. The world forgets easily when the drums fall silent. He would have to carry this music within him, even into days of shadow. He turned once more toward the fallen giant's blade, the one he had buried in the earth. It remained there, upright, gleaming faintly. The sun struck its edge, and for an instant it flared with white fire. The sound that came from it was not steel meeting wind, but something purer, the faint singing of metal remembering its origin. He approached it, placed a hand upon its hilt, and felt the vibration run through him, recognition, not ownership. The sword was not his, but it knew him. It had been waiting for his spirit to match its tone. He left it there, embedded in the earth, and whispered, "Stay until the world is ready to hear you." Then he walked away without looking back. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint hum of the unseen forge, slow, measured, eternal. It followed him as he disappeared into the light, a melody only heaven could hear. And above the quiet valley the anvil struck once more. The sword glowed in answer, its song lifting through the air like incense. The first song of battle had ended, and in its echo, the world began to remember peace. Years passed, yet the hum never left him. Even when the songs of victory faded and the cheers of men turned to politics and praise, David could still hear it, the quiet vibration beneath the world, like a pulse waiting for the next breath of creation. The valley where the giant fell had long been forgotten by others, overgrown with grass and wildflowers, but in his memory, it still glowed. Every night when he closed his eyes, he could feel the earth beneath that valley breathing in rhythm with his own heart. He was no longer a shepherd. The people now called him king, but the throne, heavy with gold, felt lighter than the harp that once rested in his arms. He missed the silence of the hills, the conversations with wind and water. Now the air was filled with voices, advisors, soldiers, enemies cloaked as friends. Their words were sharp, their hearts restless. Yet through it all, he still listened for that single divine tone that once rose from the forge of heaven. It had guided him through flame and fear, but lately it had grown quiet. Some nights he would walk the palace halls alone, the stone floors cool beneath his feet. The torches flickered like weary stars. He would pause beside the great bronze doors that opened to the outer courts and listen not for sound but for memory. And sometimes, if the night was still enough, he could hear it again, faint, far away, the hum of the sword that had not yet come fully into being. It was both comfort and ache, for though he had seen the weapon in light, he had not yet touched it in the flesh. He prayed, but heaven was silent. He played, but the music now fell heavy, as though the strings themselves mourned. The fire within him flickered low, not from loss of faith, but from the sorrow of knowing too much, the sorrow that comes to those who have glimpsed divine perfection yet must live among imperfection. One evening, as the city slept and the moon hung low over Zion, David stood upon the rooftop and looked toward the east. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of fig and dust. He whispered, "Why has the song grown distant? Have I done something to still the forge?" No answer came, only the murmur of leaves, the slow breath of the city below. But then faintly he heard it, not from heaven but from within. The sound was different this time, softer, wounded, almost human. The flame that once roared like thunder now whispered through tears. He pressed a hand against his chest and felt the warmth rise again. The hum deepened, trembling. And then, for the first time, it spoke with sorrow. Every blade must learn to weep before it can understand mercy. He fell to his knees. The message pierced him deeper than any wound. "Then teach me," he whispered, "even if it breaks me." The voice returned, quieter still. To bear what is holy is to carry both light and lament. The sword that sings must first remember sorrow, for without it its song would be cruel. He bowed his head, and tears fell to the stones, darkening them. Each drop shimmered faintly before vanishing, as though consumed by unseen flame. The air around him shifted, and for a moment the palace roof seemed to fade away. He was once again standing before the unseen forge, but it was different now. The anvil glowed dimly, and upon it lay the blade, radiant, unfinished, and trembling as though alive. It was weeping. The sound was not one of pain, but of remembrance, the lament of light that had seen too much blood, too much pride. The sword wept for every soul that would one day call upon it for conquest rather than clarity. It wept for angels who had forgotten their songs, and for men who built kingdoms without listening to heaven's rhythm. David reached out, his hand hovering above it. The heat was unbearable, yet he did not withdraw. "I understand," he whispered. "To heal one must bleed, to sing one must break." The blade pulsed once in answer. Its tears turned to fire, and the fire turned to light. He woke upon the rooftop, his face wet with both rain and tears. The dawn was breaking, gold spilling over the city like oil poured from unseen hands. And in that new light, David felt the hum again, but now it carried both joy and grief. The sword's song had changed. It was no longer only sound, it was compassion, remembering. He rose and whispered to the wind, "Then let it weep through me, until mercy becomes sharper than iron." And far beyond, in the unseen forge of eternity, the blade glowed softly, its edge shimmering not with flame, but with tears. The years grew heavy, and so did the air around the king. His crown gleamed like captured sunlight, but beneath it, his thoughts turned darker, not from doubt in God, but from the ache of carrying both power and remembrance. The harp that once drew heaven close now sat silent in the corner of his chamber. And each night when the fires burned low, he would feel that hum again, quieter now, distant, like a voice singing through layers of water. He had learned what no warrior wants to learn, that victory and peace do not speak the same language. The blade that struck down arrogance could not silence the wars of the heart, for even the chosen can fracture under the weight of purpose. And the hum, that holy sound that had guided him since boyhood, began to change. It grew sadder, not dimmer, but deeper, as though mourning what it once celebrated. When David prayed, he no longer felt the fire's certainty. He felt its sorrow, the weeping of divine light bound to flesh. One evening, when the lamps flickered low, he took up the harp again, its strings layered with dust. His fingers trembled as he plucked the first note. The sound that rose was no longer triumphant, no longer radiant. It was weary and yet beautiful in its humility. He closed his eyes and tears followed his voice. The melody poured through the corridors like the breath of a penitent soul. Servants paused, guards lowered their heads. Even the night outside seemed to stop and listen. The song spoke of crowns that grow too heavy, of victories that carve hollows into the heart, of love that outlives every mistake. It was a song for no one and everyone, a psalm of remorse. And heaven listened. The unseen forge flickered again. The sword upon its anvil shimmered, its light dimmed, its edge curved with sorrow. But from that sorrow came beauty. For just as metal gains strength through cooling and striking, so too does mercy gain depth through pain. The blade that would bear David's name was not meant to shine, it was meant to understand. The fire that had once filled his chest now felt like a heartbeat, steady, quiet, alive. It spoke again, not in command but in compassion. Do not grieve the silence, David. Even light must rest between songs. He bowed his head. I have failed, he whispered. I have wounded where I should have healed. The voice within answered gently. The blade weeps not for failure, but for forgetting that all wounds are doors through which grace enters. He could not speak. Only tears came, falling to the harp strings soft as rain. And in the space between notes he began to feel it again, the hum returning, fragile but familiar, wrapping around his sorrow like forgiveness made sound. For it was true. The divine did not demand perfection. It asked only remembrance. Even brokenness, when offered in honesty, became music. The sword's glow brightened somewhere beyond the stars. Its tears turned to silver fire, running down its length like liquid light. It had learned what its maker intended all along, that its edge would not be known for how deeply it could cut, but for how deeply it could heal. David's song shifted. It became softer, slower, a lullaby for the weary world. He sang of rivers that forgive the stones they carry, of fire that refuses to consume, of kings who bow to silence rather than applause. The words were not his own. They flowed through him like prophecy written in melody. And when he finished, the last note hung in the air for a long, trembling moment before dissolving. The torches flickered out, one by one, as if bowing to the dark. The king set down his harp and turned toward the open window. Outside, Jerusalem slept beneath a blanket of quiet stars. He whispered to the night, "If the sword must bear my name, let it never forget its tears." The wind answered with a breath of warmth, the faint echo of the forge still burning beyond time. And in that moment, though alone, David felt less a king and more a vessel, a keeper of the song that weeps for all creation. The blade within him gleamed unseen, its edge no longer hungry, its fire at peace. He closed his eyes, and in the stillness of his chamber, heaven sighed not in judgment, but in love. As the years unspooled like slow-burning incense, the weight of time settled upon David's shoulders like an invisible mantle. He had known triumph, prophecy, betrayal, and forgiveness, And now, in the twilight of his reign, the sound that once blazed through his youth had become a whisper that followed him like a faithful friend. The fire was no longer a storm within him, but a small, steady light, the ember of understanding. The palace had grown quiet. His sons quarreled in distant halls, his advisors spoke in careful tones. The city outside breathed with the rhythm of markets, of prayers, of secrets. Yet within the king's chamber all was still. He spent his nights by the window where the light of the moon brushed the stones like memory. His harp, worn smooth by years of worship and lament, rested across his knees. He did not play for the court anymore. He played for the silence itself. That evening, as the first stars rose, he felt the hum return in full. It moved through him like breath, ancient and unhurried. The same tone that once thundered through valleys now spoke like a heartbeat between worlds. He closed his eyes and the room fell away. He was standing once more before the unseen forge, but it was not as it had been. The fires burned softer, the anvil glowed with golden sorrow. Upon it lay the sword, completed now, but still alive, its surface trembling as though breathing. Light moved through it, slow as oil, deep as grief. It was beautiful beyond words and yet unbearably sad, as if it carried all the tears of creation within its edge. David fell to his knees before it. "Why does it weep still?" he asked, his voice breaking. The forge answered not with flame, but with silence, the kind that speaks of knowing too vast for words. The light upon the sword flickered and dimmed, then shone brighter. He understood. The blade did not weep for pain, but for compassion. It had seen too much. It remembered the fall of angels, the flood that drowned the world, the prayers of mothers who buried their sons. It wept because it loved what it could not save. And in that revelation, David too began to weep. His tears fell upon the unseen floor, joining those of the blade. He whispered, "Then let me share its sorrow. Let my reign bear its mercy." The voice that had once thundered now spoke through the warmth of the light. "The sword bears your name not for conquest, but for compassion. The song you sang in battle was the first note. This is the last." He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the blade. The heat was gentle now, like the breath of a sleeping child. The light moved from it into him, flowing through his veins, settling behind his ribs. The sound, that eternal hum, filled his body one final time. But this time it did not overwhelm. It comforted. The sword's weeping slowed. The tears along its edge crystallized into something radiant, not salt, not water, but light frozen in motion. The forge dimmed. The hammer rested. Creation exhaled. He opened his eyes. The vision faded, and he was once more in his chamber. The harp lay across his lap, and a single tear, glowing faintly, rested upon one of its strings. He plucked it gently. The sound that rose was not of this world. It was the same note he had heard as a boy, the sound before steel, before speech, before stars. But now it carried something more: tenderness. He realized then what all prophets must: that power means nothing without pity, and light without empathy blinds. The true sword of God was not the one of iron, but the one that could bleed and forgive in the same breath. Outside, the dawn began to rise, slow and golden. The city stirred awake, unaware that its king sat wrapped in holy grief. The tear upon the harp string had vanished, absorbed by sound. David lifted his gaze toward the east, his face wet but serene. "Let this be the final song," he whispered. "The one that teaches heaven how to weep with man, and man how to love like heaven." And far above the waking world, where light and sound sleep in one another's arms, the sword rested in silence, not vanquished, not triumphant, but complete. Its song had become mercy, and its tears had turned into dawn. The mornings of David's old age were tender things, fragile as the light that broke between olive branches. The once mighty king, whose hands had steadied armies and struck chords that moved the heavens, now rose slowly, each step a prayer of gratitude for breath. The palace had grown still around him. Voices hushed when he passed, not from fear, but reverence for a soul that had learned to walk in two worlds at once. He would spend his dawns upon the rooftop, where wind and light met without ceremony. The city stretched before him, humming faintly, the same eternal hum that had followed him since his youth, though now it sounded like the heartbeat of Jerusalem itself. He could no longer tell if the sound came from within or from the stones beneath his feet. Perhaps it was both. He sat wrapped in a simple robe and looked toward the horizon. His harp lay beside him, its strings aged but unbroken. He had not played for weeks, perhaps months. The flame that had once demanded music was now silent, resting. He touched the wood gently, tracing each groove like the lines of an old psalm, and whispered, "You have sung what words could never hold." Below, the people moved through their morning rituals, water drawn from wells, prayers whispered at doorways. He watched them with the quiet affection of one who knows that every soul carries a spark of the same divine fire. He had long ceased to see himself as above them. He was simply another ember in the great song of being, burning for a while, then returning to light. As the sun climbed higher, his breath began to tremble. The air felt thicker, almost sacred. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back upon the hill of his youth, the fields golden, the sheep grazing, the wind alive with unseen music. The boy he had once been still stood there, harp in hand, eyes lifted toward a sky that had never stopped listening. Then he heard it again, the weeping of the sword. But this time the sound was not sorrowful. It was joy, the pure, fragile joy of something that has finally fulfilled its purpose. It called to him gently, not as command, but as invitation. He rose, unsteady yet unafraid, and walked to the edge of the roof. The city glowed beneath him, every stone touched by gold. The hum deepened, wrapping around him like a cloak. He could feel the fire stir one last time, not to burn, but to bless. "Have I done all I was meant to do?" he asked the wind. The answer came as a whisper, tender as breath. "You have turned the weapon into witness. You have taught the blade to cry, and through its tears the world will remember love." He smiled faintly, tears forming once more, not of regret, but of recognition. "Then let it be finished," he murmured. "Let my last note belong to you." He took up the harp one final time. His fingers, though frail, found the strings as if guided by unseen hands. The sound that rose was weightless, a thread of light winding upward through the morning air. It carried no melody that men could write, no rhythm that time could measure. It was the sound of a life remembering its beginning, of creation returning to its first tone. Each note shimmered, becoming something more than sound. Birds took flight as though to carry it. Trees in the courtyard leaned. Even the stones seemed to listen. The light around him brightened until the boundaries between heaven and earth blurred like ink in water. And then in that perfect merging he saw it, the sword of David, whole and radiant, descending in silence. It was no longer the weapon of conquest or symbol of power, it was light itself, shaped by mercy. Its edge glowed with tears turned to crystal fire. It hovered before him, humming with the same rhythm as his heart. David smiled. "I'm ready." The sword bowed, its radiance folding into him like breath returning to lungs. The hum within him deepened, then stilled, not ending, but dissolving into the greater harmony of the unseen. When the servants found him, he was seated by the harp, his face peaceful, the morning sun crowning him in gold. The harp still vibrated faintly, singing the last note of the first song ever sung. And far beyond the reach of stars, in the forge where all beginnings sleep, the sword no longer wept. It rested. Its light joined the eternal silence, the silence from which all songs are born. After David's passing, Jerusalem entered a silence that felt almost holy. The people mourned not only a king, but the presence that had once hummed beneath their every heartbeat, that strange, unearthly resonance that seemed to make the air itself sing when he prayed. The palace grew quieter. The courtyards, once filled with music, now held only echoes of strings that would never be plucked again. But beneath that stillness, something remained. In the stone foundations of the throne room, in the breath between prayers, in the rustle of curtains when no wind stirred, the hum endured. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet alive. Some said it was the echo of David's songs still circling the heavens. Others whispered that the sword he had forged through mercy, unseen by mortal eyes, now slept beneath the palace itself, buried where the earth still remembered his touch. Years passed. Solomon, son of David, sat upon the throne, a king of wisdom, a vision of light. His reign shimmered like gold poured into the cracks of an ancient jar. He built temples where heaven and earth could meet, and when he prayed, even the stars seemed to lean closer. But though his words were wise and his understanding deep, there were nights when he too heard it, that whisper beneath the throne. At first he dismissed it as imagination. The wind, perhaps, the movement of stone. But one night, as the city slept and the moonlight spilled through the high windows like silver wine, he knelt alone in the great hall. The torches flickered low. The marble glowed faintly. And then he heard it again. It was not sound, not truly. It was vibration, like a secret heartbeat in the walls. He placed his hand upon the floor, and the cold stone trembled faintly beneath his palm. The hum rose almost imperceptibly until it filled the chamber, not loud but infinite. It carried something familiar, something ancient. He closed his eyes, and words formed in his mind without speech. The blade does not rest where it is buried. It rests where it is remembered. His breath caught. The air thickened as if the unseen had entered the room. He could smell cedar and iron, the scent of his father's youth, of fields and rain and fire. The hum deepened, wrapping around his heartbeat. He whispered, "Father." The answer came not in voice but in understanding. The sword was never steel. It was faith given shape. It sleeps beneath the throne not to guard it, but to remind it that power without mercy is ruin. Solomon bowed his head. "Then let me govern as you sang, not with might, but with music." The hum softened almost approvingly. And then for a heartbeat he saw it, faint as breath upon glass, the outline of the sword glimmering through the stone floor beneath him. Its edge shone not with fire, but with tears that had turned to light. He reached toward it, and the air pulsed. The voice, ancient, tender, filled the room. "When wisdom forgets compassion, the blade awakens. When power forgets prayer, it remembers its edge." He drew back, humbled. "Then may I never wake it," he whispered. From that night onward, Solomon ruled with a listening heart. He built his temple as his father's harp, every stone a note, every column a string that carried sound upward to God. He wrote of love, of longing, of the mystery of time, but always beneath his words that hum persisted. The whisper beneath the throne became the rhythm of his reign. And though the world saw only gold and glory, there were moments when the king would pause mid-prayer, his eyes far away, and smile faintly, for he alone knew that the true foundation of his kingdom was not stone or law or sword, but song. The people thought they ruled by decree, but heaven knew better. The throne stood because it listened. And deep below, where the earth still glowed faintly from a fire older than creation, the sword slept on, not dead, but dreaming. It was waiting for the next time the world forgot to listen. In the days that followed that night, Solomon carried the memory of the hum within him like a secret pulse. He did not speak of it to his counselors or to the priests, for how could one explain to men of law the voice that sings beneath stone? Yet everywhere he walked, he could feel it, that faint trembling in the earth, that subtle warmth in the air, as though his father's harp still played beneath the palace floor. He began to understand that the sword's rest was not sleep, but vigilance. It listened to every judgment he made, every command he uttered, every moment when compassion warred with pride. And when his voice softened, when mercy triumphed over wrath, the hum deepened, gentle, approving, alive. But when his temper rose, when he felt himself drifting toward arrogance, the vibration would fade, as though the earth itself turned its face away. One afternoon, as he sat upon the throne hearing the pleas of his people, a case was brought before him, two women, both trembling, both weeping, each claiming to be the mother of the same child. The court murmured, the guards shifted, and Solomon bowed his head. For a moment the hum beneath him vanished completely, and in its place came silence so pure it hurt to breathe. He lifted his gaze slowly. "Bring me a sword," he said. Gasps filled the hall. The guards hesitated, but his eyes burned with calm authority. One stepped forward, carrying a blade, not the true one, but a common weapon of the palace guard. Solomon held it high, and for an instant its edge caught the light, flashing like memory. "Divide the child," he said softly. "Give half to each." The words hung in the air like judgment itself. The women cried out. One fell to her knees, her voice breaking. "No, let her have the child, my lord, only let him live." And in that moment the hum returned, deep, radiant, unmistakable. It thrummed beneath the throne like the breath of God. Solomon smiled faintly, his eyes wet. He lowered the sword. "Give the child to her," he said, "for the true mother is not known by blood but by mercy." The court erupted in awe, yet Solomon heard only the low, trembling hum, singing softly beneath the stones, the same sound that had followed his father, the same tone that had forged the unseen sword. It pulsed now with joy, for the weapon of judgment had been turned once again into a song of compassion. When the hall emptied and the night grew deep, Solomon remained alone. He knelt beside the throne and placed his palm against the floor. The stone was warm. The hum rose beneath his touch like the purring of a living creature. "I understand now," he whispered. "The sword beneath me weeps not for violence but for mercy withheld. When I listen, it sleeps. When I forget, it stirs." The air trembled faintly, and for a moment he thought he heard a voice soft as wind moving through cedar leaves. "The sword does not guard kings. It reminds them that they are mortal." He bowed his head lower. "Then keep me mortal, O Lord," he prayed. "Let me never rise so high that I forget the dust from which I came." The torches flickered, their flames bending toward the throne. The hum deepened, steady and slow, until it became indistinguishable from his own heartbeat. From that night forward, he ruled as one who walked upon sacred ground. His wisdom grew not from knowledge, but from humility, from knowing that beneath all his power lay the whisper of something greater than kingship. And yet, as years passed and peace spread through the land, the hum began to fade once more. Prosperity dulled the hunger for truth. Comfort softened the need for reverence. Solomon still prayed, still built, still sang his songs of love and wisdom, but sometimes when the halls were too quiet, he would press his hand to the floor and hear nothing. That silence frightened him more than any enemy, for silence, he knew, was not absence, it was warning. And somewhere deep below, where the sword of David slept in its cradle of light, the tears that once cooled its edge began to stir again. The earth trembled softly, not in anger but in remembrance. The blade was listening. The silence beneath the throne grew heavier with each passing season. It did not vanish completely. No, that would have been mercy. It lingered instead like a withheld breath, a waiting presence that pressed against Solomon's chest whenever he prayed. The hum that once comforted him now felt buried, muffled beneath layers of gold and ambition. He had built what his father dreamed, a kingdom radiant with wisdom, a temple where heaven itself might dwell. Pilgrims came from distant lands to hear his words, and they called him blessed among men. But deep inside, Solomon felt a strange hollowness, the kind that grows when the soul mistakes the sound of praise for the voice of God. One night, as clouds rolled over Jerusalem and thunder muttered over the hills, Solomon walked barefoot into the great hall. The torches burned low, and their light seemed nervous. He stood before the throne, the very seat under which the sword was said to sleep, and for a moment he thought he heard the hum again, faint like a heartbeat under earth. But then it faded, swallowed by silence. He fell to his knees. "Why have you withdrawn?" he whispered. "Have I not built what you commanded? Have I not sung the wisdom you gave me?" The silence thickened, almost cruel. Then from somewhere deep below, a sound rose, not the gentle hum of his youth, but a low, sorrowful vibration that trembled through the stones. It was not anger, but grief. It was the sound of something divine remembering what man forgets. He pressed his palms to the floor. "Tell me," he begged, "what have I done?" The voice that came was neither word nor wind. It was understanding itself, burning within him like a sudden flame. "You have built with your mind what your heart no longer listens to." He bowed his head. The truth struck him harder than thunder. The temples, the songs, the wisdom, all perfect in form, yet hollow without the fire that once made them living. He had preserved the structure of heaven but forgotten its heartbeat. The floor beneath him pulsed once, and an image filled his mind. The sword beneath the throne, glowing faintly, trembling as though it felt his sorrow. Its light was no longer clear. It flickered, caught between gold and shadow. The blade wept, its tears falling into the stone, seeping upward like water through cracks. And Solomon understood. The sword's sorrow was not for him, but for all who would come after, those who would build empires upon the memory of truth, yet forget the tenderness that birthed it. The whisper beneath the throne was not a warning, it was mourning. He lay prostrate, his cheek against the cool marble. "Then let me remember again," he prayed. "Let me hear what my father heard when he was still only a shepherd." The hum returned, faint at first, then growing steadier, like a heartbeat quickening with hope. The throne itself seemed to breathe. The sound was not only beneath him now, it was within him. It spoke again, softer, almost kind. "You cannot rebuild innocence, Solomon, but you can return to humility. When wisdom kneels, the forge awakens." He stayed there until dawn, his tears soaking the stone. When he rose, the air around him shimmered faintly, the palace alive once more with that ancient hum. It did not roar. It did not command. It simply existed, a reminder that heaven never truly leaves those who still dare to bow. That morning, when the court assembled, the king's face glowed with quiet resolve. He spoke less of glory, more of mercy. He commanded that bread be given freely from the temple stores, that debts be forgiven in the year of peace. And though his advisors whispered of weakness, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. Rain came to the parched fields. The sick began to heal. But deep below, the sword still stirred. It did not rest completely, for it knew what Solomon did not yet see, that the world, for all its wisdom, would one day forget the hum again. The blade remained beneath the throne, glowing softly, whispering to the stones, singing its silent hymn of remembrance. Power is only pure when it kneels. Wisdom is only holy when it weeps. And in the heart of the palace, where no man could hear, the earth sighed, half in peace, half in warning. Years passed, and the golden age of Solomon ripened into twilight. The city glowed brighter than ever before, marble temples, jeweled towers, songs drifting from the courtyards at dusk. Yet beneath its beauty lay a stillness that troubled the heart. The hum that once filled Jerusalem, that soft vibration of heaven breathing through stone, grew faint. It lingered in the temple walls, in the spaces between prayers, but it no longer moved through the people as it had in the days of David. The throne stood heavy with gold, its carvings glinting in candlelight. But beneath it, the whisper had grown tired. The sword of David, the blade of compassion forged from fire, sorrow, and song, now slept restlessly in its cradle of light. It trembled not with anger but with ache, for it could feel what men could not, the slow forgetting of mercy. Solomon, older now, sat upon the throne with the weariness of one who has seen the circle of glory complete itself. His wisdom had brought prosperity, but also pride. His people praised his brilliance, but they no longer trembled before the mystery that had once kept them humble. He could feel it, the distance between heaven and earth widening, though the temple stood tall. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to the great hall. The air was heavy, the torches burning low, their smoke curling like incense lost without prayer. He walked barefoot to the center of the floor and stood above the spot where the whisper had always lived. The stone was cool. The silence, enormous. He knelt and pressed his hand to the marble. "Are you still here?" he asked, his voice barely more than breath. "Have I built too much and listened too little?" For a long while there was nothing, only the sound of his own breathing, the faint hiss of flame. Then, just as he began to withdraw his hand, he felt it, a vibration so soft it could have been imagination. The hum rose once more, but this time it was different, low, sorrowful, ancient. It did not comfort. It remembered. The voice came through that hum, not in words, but in knowing. Every kingdom forgets the sound it was born from. Solomon closed his eyes, tears forming. Then what must I do? Listen, came the answer. For when the stones grow silent, it is not because heaven has left, but because men have ceased to echo it. He lowered his head. The truth pierced him more sharply than any sword. He saw then how the gift of wisdom could harden into pride, how knowledge could turn sacred things into trophies. He saw his own reflection in the polished floor, a king wrapped in light yet shadowed within. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive the crown for forgetting the cradle." The hum deepened, the ground itself seemed to sigh. For an instant the hall brightened as though dawn had entered, though it was still night. Beneath the throne, the sword of David flared with soft blue light, its edge gleaming not with wrath, but renewal. The marble beneath Solomon's hand grew warm, pulsing like the skin of a living thing. And then faintly, the sound of weeping filled the chamber. Not his own, but something older, the same lament that had echoed through his father's harp, through the fire of the forge, through the history of every heart that had ever listened. It was the sword's song. The old king bowed lower, his tears falling into the cracks of the stone. "Then let it be remembered," he said softly. "Let the throne always tremble with the sound of humility. Let every ruler after me hear the whisper beneath their feet." The light faded. The hum returned to silence, not as absence but as promise. When dawn came, Solomon gathered his scribes and commanded them to carve upon the stone steps of the throne. Power is a song, not a weapon. Wisdom is not to know, but to listen. And from that day onward, though the hum grew faint with generations, the earth beneath the palace never forgot the tone. In times of peace, it sang quietly through the floors. In times of pride, it fell silent. It was not judgment, but remembrance, a living covenant between heaven and dust. Centuries later, when storms shook the city and empires rose upon its ruins, some swore they could still feel it, that pulse, that low vibration beneath the ground. They called it the heart of David, but the old ones knew. It was not a heart. It was the sword still sleeping, still weeping, still whispering to the stones, "When mercy is forgotten, I will awaken again." And the earth, faithful and ancient, held its silence, waiting. Generations passed, and Jerusalem became a city layered in memory, altars upon ruins, songs upon silence, prayers upon dust. The gold of Solomon's throne faded, the temple's pillars darkened with age, and kings came and went like passing shadows. Yet beneath it all, beneath stone and blood and the footsteps of centuries, the sword still slept. It had lain there through peace and war, through famine and feast, through the rise of prophets and the silence of heaven. The earth knew it was there. Sometimes, when the wind moved just right through the streets, a faint hum could be heard beneath the markets, the wells, the very breath of the city, the same tone that once sang in David's harp, soft and sorrowful, half forgot. But then came a time when the world grew restless. Kings ruled not from wisdom, but from fear. The songs of David were sung still, but their words were hollow. The temple still stood, but its prayers no longer trembled with awe. Even the scribes wrote without listening. And though no one could name the unease that crept through the land, the stones beneath Jerusalem felt it first. One night a storm rose without warning. It came not from the sea, but from the desert, a wind that carried dust from forgotten graves. The clouds gathered thick and fast, swallowing the moon. The priests lit candles in the temple, their flames wavering though no draft passed through the sacred halls. Somewhere deep beneath, the ground began to hum. At first it was faint, the old familiar tone, rising through the cracks of the earth like a heartbeat waking from long sleep. Then it deepened, spreading through the city walls, vibrating through the foundations of the temple, the palace, even the tombs. Birds lifted into the storm, crying. The torches flickered out one by one. The sword was stirring. It did not awaken in wrath, but in grief. It remembered too much. The songs of mercy it was forged to protect, now replaced by chants of conquest. The fire that once burned within David's chest now burned across nations, not to heal but to consume. The blade wept again, and its tears seeped through the ground, silver in the dark. A child, a shepherd's son, as it had been in the beginning, was the first to feel it. He woke in the night, the storm roaring outside his small window, and felt the floor tremble beneath him. He pressed his ear to the ground and heard the sound, low, distant, beautiful. It frightened him and yet filled him with peace. He ran to his father, crying, "The earth is singing." The man laughed softly, half asleep. "It is thunder, child." But it was not thunder. The next day, rumors spread through the city. The priests claimed they felt the ark tremble during prayer. Merchants said their scales moved though the wind was still. The well in the lower market began to glow faintly at night, its water resonating with an unearthly hum. None understood it. Few dared to speak it aloud. But those who still remembered the old psalms whispered a single word in fear and reverence: the sword. Beneath the temple, where no man had walked for centuries, light began to pulse through the cracks of the stone. The air smelled faintly of cedar and fire. The tears of the sword glowed brighter, flowing into the earth like veins of silver. It was not anger that woke it, but sorrow for a people who prayed without listening, who built altars to the voice they no longer heard. And yet within that sorrow there was still hope. The blade did not rise to destroy. It stirred to remind. The hum spread farther, reaching the wilderness beyond the walls, where hermits prayed in silence and farmers lifted their faces to the rain. The faithful wept without knowing why. The unfaithful dreamed of fire. And far above, where heaven bends toward earth, the forge of light flickered once more. The anvil that had cooled since Solomon's reign glowed faintly, as though remembering its work. The sword's voice, long silent, whispered through the bones of the world. The song is fatting. The fire must find another heart. And somewhere a young boy lifted his eyes to the storm and felt something ancient awaken inside him, not fear but calling. The wind pressed against his chest, warm as breath, and the hum filled his veins. He did not know yet what it meant, but heaven did. The sword had begun to remember its purpose. The boy's name was Elior, and though he was only 12, he carried in his gaze the same quiet fire that had once burned in the eyes of shepherds and kings. His father tended goats among the lower hills of Bethlehem, where stones whispered in the wind and old psalms still echoed faintly between the rocks. The family was poor, but peace lived in their small home, until the night the earth began to hum. From that night onward, Elior could no longer sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw light beneath the ground, a glow like molten metal, pulsing in rhythm with his heart. When he prayed, he felt warmth gather in his chest. When he sang the hymns his mother taught him, the very walls of their home trembled as if listening. His father watched him in silence, fearful yet tender. "You dream like the prophets of old," he said one morning. "But beware, my son, the world does not love those who listen too closely." Elior smiled. "Then I will listen in secret." But the secret was not his to keep. Days later, the storm returned, black clouds gathering over the desert, though no season called for rain. The winds rose, tearing dust from the hills, and lightning traced symbols in the sky that no man could read. In the midst of that storm, Elior heard it again, the hum deeper and closer now. It came from beneath the valley, from the very heart of the land. He ran from the house barefoot, drawn not by curiosity but by certainty. The rain lashed his face, the thunder shook his bones, yet the sound beneath it all was clear as breath. "Come." He followed it through the ravine until he reached the mouth of an old well, half-collapsed, long abandoned. The air there shimmered faintly. He knelt beside it and placed his hand upon the stones. The vibration pulsed through his skin, through his bones, through the very marrow of him. The hum was alive, sorrowful, patient, waiting. Elior closed his eyes and whispered the only words he knew: "I am here." At that instant the storm ceased. The wind stilled, the thunder stopped mid-roar, and for a single heartbeat all of creation seemed to listen. A light rose from the well, soft at first, then growing, golden, liquid, like dawn breaking upward from beneath the earth. The boy fell back in awe as the light swirled into the shape of a blade, faint, translucent, breathing. The sword of David had awakened. Its song filled the valley, not a sound of war, but of remembering. It sang of kings and shepherds, of sorrow turned to mercy, of the silence that binds heaven to earth. The light wrapped around Elior like wind made of warmth, and within it he felt both terror and peace. He bowed his head. "What do you want of me?" The answer came not in words, but in knowing, to be heard again. The boy wept. "But I am only a child." "So was the one before you," came the whisper. "It is not age that awakens sound. It is innocence that remembers it." The light dimmed, folding into itself, until all that remained was a single ember hovering above the well, a spark that drifted forward and rested against Elior's chest. He gasped as it sank into him, dissolving into warmth. The hum grew louder within his ribs, steady and deep, as though a hidden heartbeat had been restored. He fell to his knees, trembling. The storm began again, not of destruction but renewal, rain falling softly now, washing the dust from the stones, filling the cracks of the earth like tears returning home. When he returned to the village, drenched and shaking, his father met him at the door. "What have you done?" he whispered, for he saw the light still faintly flickering beneath his son's skin. "I listened," said Elior simply. That night as the boy slept, the hum spread through the valley, passing from stone to tree, from stream to wind. The shepherds awoke and looked to the hills, where the rain shimmered with gold. The oldest among them wept, for they remembered stories their fathers had told of a sword that sang when the world forgot mercy. And far below the temple, where the blade's original form still rested, its light burned brighter than it had in centuries. The two songs, the buried and the living, now resonated together, heaven and earth humming in unison. The forge was awakening once more. The fire had found another heart. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen in the hills of Bethlehem. The shepherds whispered that their flocks moved as one, guided by an unseen rhythm in the earth. The old wells, long dry, began to glimmer faintly at dusk, their waters trembling with a sound too low to name. Even the olive trees seemed to lean toward the east, their leaves shivering though the air was still. Something ancient was returning, something both tender and terrible. Elior woke each morning with the hum alive in his chest. It was not loud, yet it filled every moment of his day. When he breathed, the earth seemed to breathe with him. When he sang, the air shimmered faintly around his voice. His father watched him from the doorway as he worked, afraid to speak, afraid to disturb whatever divine current had claimed the boy. At night, Elior dreamed of light moving through tunnels of stone. He saw the buried sword deep beneath Jerusalem, glowing in the dark like a tear that refused to dry. It pulsed faintly, and with every pulse he felt its sorrow, the sorrow of memory, of mercy forgotten, of the long silence of heaven waiting for a listener. One evening, as the sun sank red over the western hills, he heard the hum rise stronger than ever. It moved through the ground like a wave, lifting dust into spirals, bending the grass as though under a great breath. Elior fell to his knees, clutching his chest. The hum inside him answered, trembling in harmony. The sky darkened. The horizon glowed gold, then white. He saw not with his eyes, but with the memory that lived in his blood, the forge again. The great anvil floating in fire, the song that shaped the worlds, the tears of the first flame turning into stars. The sword was there, suspended above the anvil, not bound by hand or hammer but by the will of mercy itself. It turned slowly in the air, its surface alive with faces, kings, prophets, mothers, children, all who had ever listened to heaven's whisper. Elior recognized them without knowing how. They were not the dead, they were the remembered. Then the voice came vast and intimate like thunder whispering inside the heart. The song returns, and yet the world still sleeps. Will you wake it, child? Elior bowed low. Tell me how. Not with war, the voice said, but with witness. The sound must be heard again in human hearts, not temples. The fire must move through song, not sword. The light flared, and for a moment he saw David not as a king, but as a shepherd boy, his eyes bright with the same fire that now burned in Elior. He was smiling. Behind him stood Solomon, older, wiser, his hands resting upon a harp that glowed like sunrise. Between them hovered the sword, silent, its tears turned to light. The voice continued. The blade once sang through kings. Now it must sing through children. Go to the city that forgets. Walk its streets and listen. When the world mocks, you must still sing. When they cast stones, let your sound be stillness. The sword does not strike, it remembers. Elior nodded, tears falling freely. Then let me remember too. The vision faded. The valley returned. The sky had cleared and stars burned above like embers in an unseen forge. The hum still filled his chest, softer now but steady. He rose and began walking barefoot, staff in hand, toward the distant lights of Jerusalem. As he walked, animals stirred in their dens. Birds rose from trees and followed him for a time, their wings catching the moonlight. In the villages he passed, lamps flickered and doors opened. The people felt something, not fear, but awe, as though the night itself had begun to breathe again. By dawn, he reached the gates of the city. The guards, seeing only a boy with wild hair and eyes full of sky, laughed and waved him through. They did not see the light faintly glowing beneath his ribs or the way the ground hummed when his feet touched the stones. He entered the city quietly. The hum followed him, passing from archway to alley, from market to temple. Dogs ceased barking. The bells of dawn rang off-key and then found their harmony again. And somewhere beneath the palace, the sword trembled, not in rage but recognition. The sound it had waited for since David's final breath was walking its streets again. The fire of remembrance had found its voice. Jerusalem did not recognize him. The city that had once trembled with prayer now pulsed with the noise of trade and argument, of gold changing hands and faith turned to spectacle. The temple gleamed, but its light was hollow, a mirror reflecting nothing. Elior walked among its crowds like a shadow of something forgotten, the hum in his chest quiet but insistent, like a heartbeat hidden beneath the sound of coins. He paused at the base of the temple steps, watching priests sweep the marble floors as worshippers offered their gifts. The wind carried the scent of incense and iron, the same mingling that had marked every age of worship and war. He closed his eyes, letting the vibration in the air speak before words could. Beneath all the noise, he heard it, the faint, weary whisper of the sword below. It was weak, almost fatting, its light smothered by centuries of pride. He fell to his knees on the steps. The priests frowned, annoyed by the ragged boy who prayed where only the robed were meant to stand. One approached, stern-faced. "Child, move aside. This is not a place for beggars." Elior lifted his gaze, his eyes soft but unyielding. "I am not begging," he said. "I am listening." The priest hesitated. The words carried no defiance, yet they trembled with something older than speech, the same tone that had once moved kings to silence. The boy placed his palms against the stone steps, and the hum within him leapt outward, resonating through the marble. It was faint at first, a murmur beneath the clamor of the city, but then it grew. The ground itself began to vibrate with music, low and holy, as though the earth were remembering how to pray. The crowd fell quiet. The merchants stopped mid-sail. Even the birds upon the temple roof froze, their wings half-folded. The sound deepened, no longer coming only from the boy but from the ground, the walls, the air itself. It was the same sound that had once filled David's harp, that had whispered beneath Solomon's throne, the tone that had shaped the world when it was still soft and new. It rose now like the breath of God returning to a body long asleep. Elior's eyes filled with tears. The vibration moved through him until his voice joined it, not singing but becoming song. Words poured from his lips unbidden, ancient syllables that no one understood yet everyone felt. The priests dropped their censers. The crowd bowed their heads without knowing why. And deep below, the sword of David answered. Its light ignited, running through cracks of forgotten stone like veins of fire. Blade did not rise, but its song rose upward, outward, through the temple, through the city, through every living thing that still carried memory of the divine. It did not call for battle, it called for awakening. Those who listened wept without reason. Those who turned away found their hearts trembling. The song carried through the streets, into houses, into prisons, into fields where the poor labored under the sun. Even the sick felt warmth pass through their bones. But as quickly as it rose, the light began to dim. The hum softened. The boy fell forward, his palms pressed to the stone as the last vibrations faded into silence. He had given all he had, his voice, his breath, his body, to reopen the sound between heaven and earth. And now the fire within him began to cool. A priest ran to him, lifting him gently. "What have you done?" he whispered. Elior smiled faintly. "I remembered," he said, "and now so will you." The man looked around. The city was quiet, the air trembling with something unseen but undeniable. Every heart beat in rhythm with every other, the hum no longer beneath them but within them. That night, as the stars appeared over the city, a soft light glowed from beneath the temple floor, steady, calm, alive. The sword of David had returned to rest, not in slumber this time, but in peace. It had found what it sought, a heart innocent enough to remember what kings had forgotten. The boy's name faded into history, his body buried among the shepherds who once listened to angels. But his song remained, not written, not recorded, but carried by wind and breath and prayer. And sometimes, when the city fell silent at night, those who listened closely swore they could still hear it, the hum beneath their feet, steady as grace. It was not the sound of a weapon. It was the sound of a world remembering how to love again. Centuries passed, and Jerusalem became a memory wrapped in dust. Kingdoms rose and fell, each carving their names into the bones of the same earth that once hummed with divine sound. Yet even as the world forgot the song, the silence never forgot the world. Beneath every ruin, every broken altar, every prayer whispered to an absent sky, the fire still breathed, quiet, patient, unyielding. In distant lands far from the hills of Zion, the tone appeared again, not as thunder, but as warmth that stirred the hearts of dreamers and poets. In deserts and cathedrals, in the voices of mothers rocking their children, in the wind between mountains, the echo moved like an invisible thread, stitching together what time had tried to tear apart. There were those who still felt it, though they could not name it. A wandering monk in the north heard it when he struck flint to light his lamp, a hum that lingered longer than stone should sing. A healer in the east felt it when her hands touched the sick, a warmth that flowed not from her but through her. Even the sea carried it, murmuring softly to itself when the moon was full, as if remembering an ancient promise. But though the tone still moved, it grew weaker with each generation. The world had become loud, a place of clashing empires, of iron and engines, of men building towers of pride and forgetting to listen. The silence that once healed now frightened them. They filled it with noise so they would not have to face the absence that was not absence, but invitation. And so the sword slept again, not buried in stone, but buried in hearts. In one such heart the fire began to stir once more. It belonged to a woman named Sarai, a weaver in a quiet village by the sea. She lived alone, her days filled with the sound of loom and thread, her nights with the murmur of the tide. But she was different not for what she did, but for how she listened. When she worked, her fingers moved as if guided by unseen rhythm. The cloth she wove shimmered strangely, as though touched by dawn. One evening, as she sat at her loom, a storm gathered over the sea. The waves rose like dark wings, and the wind rattled the shutters of her small home. She continued to weave unafraid, her hands moving to the pulse of the storm. But then between thunderclaps she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the world outside. It came from within the walls, within the floor, within her. A low, trembling hum, faint, familiar, infinite. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound grew, filling the room like a second heartbeat. The threads upon her loom began to glow faintly, threads of gold and silver where only wool had been. The storm outside fell silent. She rose slowly, her hand upon her chest. The warmth spread outward, soft and steady. It did not burn, it remembered. The hum deepened, becoming words without language, meaning without speech. The fire sleeps beneath the silence. Will you bear it again? She knelt, trembling. Who speaks? She whispered. The same that sang through kings and children. The voice answered, through harp and storm, through mercy and lament. The song waits once more for a listener. Tears welled in her eyes. But I am no prophet, I am no one. The sound does not choose prophets, it said gently. It chooses hearts that can weep without bitterness. The glow faded, leaving her loom shimmering softly in the half-light. On the cloth she had been weaving, patterns had formed not of her making. Lines of gold and shadow intertwined, forming the shape of a blade surrounded by wings. She touched it, and the hum returned, filling her veins with light. The sword had stirred again, not beneath thrones or temples, but beneath her humble hands. And in that moment, as lightning split the horizon, the silence across the world trembled with memory. The fire beneath it was awakening once more, seeking a voice to carry its truth. For heaven had chosen its next vessel, not a king, not a warrior, but a weaver of threads and grace. And the song, patient for ages, began to breathe again. That night Sarai could not sleep. The hum within her lingered like a heartbeat beneath her ribs, quiet but alive. Every breath she took shimmered faintly in the air, as if her body had become an instrument for something older than breath itself. The storm outside had passed, yet her home still glowed with the faint gold of unseen fire. She sat beside her loom until dawn, staring at the cloth she had woven. The pattern pulsed softly in the dim light, the blade and the wings intertwined, neither conquering the other. It seemed to breathe. When her fingers brushed the fabric, warmth traveled up her arm, and she heard faint whispers, not voices, but echoes of memory. David's harp, Solomon's throne, the boy who sang upon the temple steps, each whisper carried sorrow, not for what had been lost, but for what humanity had forgotten. And beneath it all she heard the same voice that had spoken to her in the storm. The fire sleeps beneath the silence. Wake it gently, and the world will remember. Sarai rose and opened the shutters. The sea was calm again, its surface glistening with the light of morning. Birds flew low over the water, their wings catching sunlight like shards of glass. She stepped outside barefoot and stood at the edge of her small garden, breathing deeply. The air felt alive, charged, almost listening. She whispered to no one, "Then let me be what I am, a thread in the great weave." When she returned to her loom, something inside her changed. She did not think, did not plan, she listened. Her hands moved with a rhythm that was not her own. The loom sang softly under her touch, each pull of thread producing not sound but resonance. It was as if the world around her began to hum in answer, the walls, the floor, even the light itself. And then, without warning, she saw him. A figure of light stood near the doorway, tall, radiant, neither man nor angel but something between. His eyes were vast as dawn, and his presence did not frighten her. He said nothing, but the air around him spoke in ripples of warmth. Sarai bowed her head instinctively. "I am not worthy," she whispered. His voice was a chord of mercy. Worthiness is not the measure, willingness is. He stepped closer, his light softening, and extended his hand toward the cloth. The golden thread upon the loom lifted into the air, twisting gently like living flame. "The sword you weave is not of iron," he said. "It is of remembrance. Each thread you place recalls a mercy forgotten. Each pattern restores what silence buried. The world has filled itself with noise. It must remember the music beneath it." She swallowed, her voice trembling. "And when the song is complete, then the silence will burn again, not in destruction, but in cleansing. The old thrones will tremble, the proud will fall to their knees, and the humble will hear what the mighty have ignored." He turned his gaze toward the window, toward the sea beyond. "The tide is coming, Sarai. The fire waits for hands that do not crave it. You have been chosen not to wield, but to remember." The vision began to fade, his form dissolving into light that drifted through the room like dust made of stars. She reached out instinctively, her fingertips passing through it. "Wait," she whispered. "Will I see you again?" "When the final thread is woven," came the fatting reply. "Until then the loom will speak for me." The room dimmed. The hum softened, settling again in her chest. She stood for a long while, hands trembling, staring at the glowing cloth before her. It no longer looked like a mere pattern, it was alive, breathing in rhythm with her. She sat once more, her tears falling silently onto the threads. "Then I will weave until the silence burned," she said softly. And as she worked, the first flame rekindled, unseen, unheard, but alive once more beneath the quiet skin of the world. Far away, mountains shivered and the sea exhaled. The sword beneath the throne pulsed once, as if it too had heard her vow. Days melted into one another and Sarai wove without ceasing. Morning light rose and fell upon her walls, and the sea beyond her home seemed to breathe with her rhythm. She no longer ate much, nor slept deeply, for each time she closed her eyes, she saw visions of light folding through darkness, of wings descending over rivers, of cities trembling in soft fire. It was not madness, it was memory returning. The loom no longer creaked as it once did. It sang. The threads that passed through her fingers shone faintly, silver at dawn, gold at dusk, crimson at midnight. She did not choose the colors, they chose themselves. Sometimes she would weep as she worked, though she did not know why. It felt as though the tears belonged not to her, but to the world, as though the earth itself was grieving through her hands. When she finished a length of cloth, she hung it across the room. Each piece bore symbols she could not read, circles within flames, eyes within rivers, crowns that melted into stars. She recognized none, yet her spirit trembled with every line. The pattern seemed to breathe, shifting slightly when she prayed. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at her door. He was a traveler, weathered and lean, with sand still clinging to his robes. "I have followed the sound," he said softly. Sarai looked at him, startled. "You hear it too?" He nodded. "All the way from the mountains." Earth hums again. Some say it is an omen. Some say the old sword has begun to sing. She lowered her gaze. "It is not a sword of war," she said quietly. "It is a sword of remembering." The man stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "Then what is it remembering?" Sarai looked to the loom, to the half-woven cloth that glowed like dawn. "Mercy," she whispered. "The sound of mercy before we learn to name it power." The traveler's eyes widened and he knelt before her. "Then you are the keeper of the flame." She shook her head. "No, only its echo." For a long time they sat in silence, the sound of the loom filling the air like distant rain. Then the man rose and placed his hand upon the cloth. The hum grew stronger, flowing through both of them. He gasped, "It's alive." "It always was," she said. "We forgot how to feel it." He stared at her as though seeing the divine through human eyes. "The world will come for you, Sarai. The kings will not abide a woman who weaves heaven from silence." She smiled faintly. "Then let them come. The fire beneath the silence cannot be silenced." That night, as the stranger slept near her door, Sarai dreamt of the sword again. It hung in darkness, suspended between two worlds, heaven above, earth below. Around it, faces formed and vanished. David's tears, Solomon's sorrow, Elior's song. Each figure knelt before the blade, and from their mouths rose light. Then she saw herself, seated before the loom, weaving not cloth but sound, threads of melody that turned into rivers of flame. The sword absorbed each note until it glowed with living fire. The voice returned. "The world will try to own what cannot be owned. They will mistake remembrance for rebellion. When they come, do not resist. The song cannot be silenced by the hand that wields it. It can only be dimmed by the heart that forgets." She awoke before dawn. The traveler was gone. Only the sound of the sea remained, rhythmic and eternal. She turned to her loom. The cloth had changed overnight. The unfinished blade upon it now shimmered with the full brilliance of fire, complete, alive, singing in silence. She fell to her knees. "It is done," she whispered. But even as she spoke, the horizon darkened. In the distance she saw torches, the glow of soldiers moving down from the cliffs. The kings had heard. The hum within her deepened, sorrowful yet unwavering. She stood, the fire reflecting in her eyes. The silence around her thickened, not with fear but with power. And as the soldiers approached, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The sea receded. The wind stilled. The fire beneath the silence was ready to speak. They came at dawn. The horizon glowed red, not from sunrise but from torches carried by men who feared what they did not understand. The king's guards descended upon the village, their armor clattering like thunder, their banners whipping in the sea wind. They had heard rumors of a woman whose weaving sang, whose hands drew fire from silence, a witch, they called her, though they did not know the name of what she served. Sarai waited for them by the door, her loom behind her still humming softly, the cloth upon it glowing faintly as though breathing. She did not run, she did not hide. The hum within her chest was calm, deep, steady, endless. She had known this hour would come, for the fire beneath the silence always drew both light and shadow toward it. The captain dismounted, his face cold beneath his helm. "You are Sarai of the sea village." "I am," she said softly. "You are accused of sorcery," he declared. "Spreading blasphemy, of stirring the earth and defying the silence of heaven." She smiled gently. "Heaven's silence is not empty," she said. "It breathes, you only fear it because you've forgotten how to listen." The men shifted uneasily. The captain scowled. "You mock the crown." "I mock no one," she replied. "I only remember." Her calmness unsettled them. The captain gestured sharply. "Seize her." They stepped forward, but the moment their boots struck the threshold, the ground beneath them trembled. The air thickened, shimmering faintly. A sound rose low, resonant, unearthly. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the sea, from the stones, from the very air between their hearts. The men froze. Their torches flickered and dimmed. The sea drew back even farther, revealing the glistening bed of the shore. Sarai closed her eyes. "You hear it now," she whispered. The captain's voice faltered. "What sorcery is this?" "It is no sorcery," she said. "It is remembrance." The hum deepened, turning into a rhythm like breathing. The loom behind her began to glow brighter, the golden cloth trembling as if alive. The threads lifted from the frame and rose into the air, spinning around her like ribbons of fire. The soldiers fell to their knees, their torches extinguished. Light flooded the village, not the harsh light of flame, but a soft, white radiance that filled every crack, every shadow, every trembling soul. The hum became a song, the song of the sword, though no sword was drawn. Its tone carried across the sea, across mountains, through temples and palaces and fields. It reached the ears of kings and beggars alike, and all who heard it wept, though they knew not why. It was the song of mercy remembering itself. Sarai raised her hands, her eyes filled with tears of light. The cloth of fire hovered before her, its form now unmistakable, the shape of the sword that once slept beneath Solomon's throne. It gleamed not as a weapon, but as a reflection of divine longing. The captain tried to speak, but his words failed. The soldiers wept openly, their armor clattering as they fell prostrate. Then came the voice, vast, tender, eternal, the same voice that had spoken to David in his youth, to Solomon in his twilight, to Elior in his innocence. The fire beneath the silence is love, not wrath, not war. Love that does not shout but shapes worlds in stillness. The sword is not to strike but to remind. The light grew so bright that the sea itself bowed, its waves folding in reverence. Sarai's body began to dissolve into that radiance, her outline turning to flame, her hair flowing like smoke caught in dawn. She was not dying, she was becoming. Her final words were a whisper that reached every soul who still had ears to hear. "Listen, and you will remember." Then she was gone. The light sank back into the earth. The waves returned. The silence that followed was vast, but it was not empty. It was full, alive, vibrating with unseen fire. The soldiers rose slowly, their faces streaked with tears. None could speak. None could return to their king. They left their weapons on the sand and walked into the dawn barefoot. In Sarai's empty house, the loom stood silent. Upon it lay one final strand of gold, glowing faintly. And sometimes, when the wind moved through the open window, the thread would hum soft, patient, eternal. Far away, beneath forgotten ruins, the sword of David pulsed once more, not in sorrow but in peace. for the fire beneath the silence had found a home again. The world changed after that morning, though few could say how. There was no decree, no proclamation, no prophet on the temple steps, only the lingering hush that settled over the earth, heavy and sacred, like the pause between heartbeats. The sea that once roared now murmured softly to the sand. The winds carried warmth instead of warning. Even the birds sang differently, as though something deep beneath creation had been healed. And yet the people could not name what had happened. They only knew that silence had ceased to be frightening. It no longer felt like absence, it felt like presence. Farmers paused in their fields just to listen. Mothers found themselves humming lullabies they did not remember learning. In cities and deserts alike, dreams began to shimmer with light. The hum had returned, faint but living, threading through the veins of the world like blood rediscovering its flow. Far beneath the earth, in the chamber where the sword of David had lain for ages untold, the air itself glowed. The blade no longer slept in sorrow. It rested in peace, its surface shining with quiet flame. The hum that had once been confined to the stone now rippled outward, touching mountains, rivers, and forgotten ruins. It moved through the roots of trees, through veins of silver and gold, through the bones of the old world and into the hearts of the new. The sword no longer sought a wielder, it sought resonance. And wherever it found one, the flame appeared. In the northern forests, a child lit a candle to pray, and the flame burned steady though the wind raged outside. In the far east, a monk meditating by a frozen lake saw the ice glow faintly beneath him, pulsing to the rhythm of his breath. In the southern deserts, a widow burying her dead husband felt warmth rise from the sand, comforting her hands. All across the earth, the soundless flame awoke not as a spectacle, but as a whisper of remembrance. The silence became a teacher again. It was said that those who truly listened could hear the swords hum through it, faint as a sigh, deep as a heartbeat. It was not the song of kings anymore, but of every soul that chose to live gently, to build instead of burn. The weapon that once split the sky had become the pulse that held the world together. But peace, even when divine, does not go untested. In the east, where the mountains met the sea, there arose a man who claimed that the flame was his to command. He built temples to it, called it the fire of dominion, and taught his followers to kneel before its light as if it were a god. He did not listen to the hum, he only sought its power. And though the silence still waited patiently for his heart to open, he filled it instead with ambition. The more he spoke of control, the dimmer the flame in his temples became. But he could not see it. He mistook the fading glow for mystery and built greater altars to demand more. His priests struck stones against gold, forcing sparks where the spirit no longer lived. And yet, somewhere far away, the true flame still burned quietly, not in temples, but in ordinary places. In the small hands of a child lighting a candle for kindness. In a woman's tears as she forgave her enemy. In the whispered prayers of those who still believed that silence could heal. For the flame was never meant to belong to thrones. It belonged to breath. And so it traveled unseen, crossing oceans, climbing mountains, moving through dreams. In time, it reached a valley so old that even the stars seemed to bow above it, a place where the air shimmered like memory. There, deep within the stone, something began to stir once more. The hum grew louder, steady, alive. The earth exhaled. The silence rippled like water struck by light. The sword was not calling for another hand to lift it. It was calling for the world to remember that it still could. The soundless flame, born from song, kept alive by mercy, was ready to return, not as a miracle, but as a mirror. In the valley where the stars leaned low enough to touch the earth, the hum deepened until the stones themselves seemed to breathe. The ancient fire that had slept through ages stirred again, not in fury, but in ache, the ache of remembrance pressing against the walls of creation. The silence was no longer still. It pulsed, gentle but vast, like the slow heartbeat of something eternal awakening after a long dream. Travelers who passed through the valley spoke of strange things. They said the air shimmered there, that the moon cast two shadows, one of body, one of soul. They said that if you listened long enough, you could hear your own heartbeat echo back to you from the ground, though it sounded older than time. Most who entered left changed. They forgot their anger. They spoke softly for days after, as though afraid to disturb something fragile and holy. And then, one night, beneath a sky heavy with stars, a child wandered into that valley. His name was Alien, a boy born of no prophecy, no lineage, no throne. He was curious, that simple kind of curiosity that belongs to the unbroken heart. His village lay beyond the hills, small and quiet, a place of farmers and fishermen. Yet for weeks he had heard the call in his sleep, a low, golden hum that followed him into waking, haunting him not with fear but with longing. He followed the sound now, barefoot and unafraid. The grass bent around his feet as he walked, as though greeting an old friend. When he reached the heart of the valley, the world grew still. Even the stars seemed to hold their breath. Then he saw it. A circle of light glowed faintly in the center of the plain, not fire, not mist, but something between. The air above it shimmered like heat over water, and within that shimmer floated the faint outline of a blade. The sword of David, reborn through silence, hovered above the earth, weightless, alive. It no longer gleamed with the blinding light of kings. It glowed softly like the last light of a candle that refuses to die. Its song was not of triumph, but of homecoming. Alien stepped closer. The hum grew louder, and he felt it in his chest, vibrating through his ribs, his spine, his very breath. It was not speaking to him, it was becoming him. The closer he drew, the more the world around him seemed to dissolve. The stars faded, replaced by visions that unfolded within the light. He saw the weaver Sarai, her hands glowing over a loom of gold. He saw the shepherd boy Elior singing upon the temple steps. He saw David kneeling in the rain, his tears mixing with fire. And behind them all, unseen but present, was the same rhythm, the same hum, threading their lives together like beads upon a divine string. He reached out. His small hand hovered just above the blade. A voice rose, soft and steady, not around him, but through him. "You are not chosen to rule," it said. "You are chosen to remember." He nodded without knowing why. The sword pulsed once, and then, like a living flame, it sank into his chest. There was no pain, only warmth, vast and weightless. His body glowed faintly, the light spreading through his veins like liquid dawn. The hum became his heartbeat, his breath, his thought. The valley shone with golden fire, and for a moment the whole world felt it, from the frozen peaks of the north to the deserts of the south, from the quiet ocean floor to the stars that circled in endless rhythm. The silence broke open like a seed, and from within it light grew. Alien stood there, eyes wide with awe. He understood nothing and everything all at once. The sword was no longer separate from him. It had become what it was always meant to be, not an object, but a harmony. And in that moment he heard the truth that had slept beneath centuries of sound. The flame was never meant to burn the world. It was meant to keep it alive. The hum faded to quiet, and the stars returned to their places. Alien looked down at his hands, now pulsing faintly with golden light. He smiled. He did not feel chosen, he felt remembered. And as dawn crept over the valley, he turned back toward the hills, carrying the silence with him, not as a burden but as breath. For the soundless flame had found its new vessel, not to rule nations but to rekindle wonder. Alien returned to his village as the first light of morning touched the sea. The world looked the same, the huts of clay, the smoke curling from chimneys, the cries of gulls wheeling above, yet everything felt changed. The air shimmered faintly around him, and every sound seemed softer, as if the earth itself was listening. The villagers saw him approach and paused in their work. Something in his step unsettled them, not pride, not strangeness, but stillness. The boy walked as though each moment were a prayer. Children fell quiet when he passed. The elders crossed themselves instinctively, sensing the old power that once moved through prophets and poets. His mother ran to meet him, her hands trembling. "Alien," she cried, "where have you been? The night was endless." He looked into her eyes, and in that gaze she saw the reflection of something vast, not distance, but depth. "I went where the silence sings," he said softly. She fell to her knees, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My son, what have you brought back with you?" He knelt beside her and took her hand. His palm was warm, almost luminous. "Only what was always here," he whispered, "the flame that never left us." That night, as the village gathered by the shore to light their lamps, they found that no fire would catch. The wood was dry, the oil plentiful, but the flames refused to live. Fear rippled through them, a quiet dread of divine displeasure. They looked to Alien, who sat apart, staring out at the sea. He rose slowly and walked to them. "Do not fear," he said. "The fire is not gone. It waits for remembrance." He knelt by one of the lamps, his hands cupped around the cold wick. The villagers held their breath. He did not strike flint or spark. He simply breathed, slow, steady, reverent. And as his breath touched the lamp, light bloomed. It was not like ordinary flame. It was softer, golden white, almost silent. The villagers gasped, stepping back in awe. The light did not consume, it comforted. The air filled with a warmth that felt like forgiveness. One by one, Alien moved from lamp to lamp, breathing light into each. Soon the entire shore glowed, waves lapping against gold reflected on water. No one spoke. They only listened to the faint hum that filled the air, the same hum that had followed the boy since the valley. When he finished, he turned to them and said, "This light is not mine. It belongs to all who remember." The eldest among them, her hair white as sea foam, stepped forward and bowed. "What do we remember, child?" He smiled. "That love does not end when sound does. That silence is not death. It is the breath of God waiting to be heard again." The people wept then, not from sorrow but from release. They felt the weight of years of forgetting slip from their shoulders. Children ran barefoot through the light, their laughter mingling with the sound of waves. The night, for the first time in generations, felt alive. Word of the miracle spread quickly. Pilgrims came from distant lands, drawn not by spectacle but by longing. They found no temple, no priest, only a boy who listened more than he spoke. And yet in his presence they remembered things they had never learned: the warmth of mercy, the peace of listening, the song beneath the silence. The flame spread with them. They carried it in their hearts, not in their hands. Wherever they went, through wars, through empires, through centuries, the hum followed. Sometimes faint, sometimes strong, but never gone. For Alien was not meant to build a kingdom. He was meant to reawaken one that never truly died, the kingdom of soundless flame, born not of conquest but of stillness. And though the boy himself would one day vanish, walking alone into the sea as quietly as he had come, his breath remained in the world. It flickered in every act of forgiveness. It burned in every tear of compassion. It whispered in every pause between heartbeats. The sword had not returned to power. It had returned to people. And the world, for a time, remembered how to glow without burning. Years passed, and Alien's name became a story. The villagers spoke of him not as a boy, but as a light that once walked among them. They said the sea itself had carried his breath into the winds, that his silence could still be heard on nights when the horizon burned with gold. Children grew up repeating his words as lullabies. Love does not end when sound does. And even those who had doubted once found themselves pausing before sleep, listening not for thunder, but for the hum that never truly left. The world changed slowly, like dawn creeping over the edges of stone. Where kingdoms once fought over fire, they began to light candles together. Scholars spoke less and prayed more. The songs of the people softened, no longer cries for conquest, but laments of remembrance, hymns of gentleness. The flame Alien had breathed into the lamps by the shore had spread far beyond that village. It had found new forms: music, mercy, forgiveness. And yet, as with all holy things, time dulled its wonder. Generations passed and the flame grew quiet again. It was not forgotten, not entirely, but buried beneath progress, reason, the clamor of a world once more too busy to listen. Cities rose where fields had stood, their towers piercing the clouds, their streets blazing with light made by human hands. The hum faded beneath the noise. Still it lingered, faint, steady, eternal. It could not die, for it was not a thing of time. It waited, patient as ever, beneath the engines and the towers, beneath the oceans and the dust, humming in the quiet moments between heartbeats. And then one night, in a city of mirrors and machines, a young woman stood alone on a rooftop. Her name was Amara. She was not holy nor wise. She was weary, the kind of weary that comes when a soul has seen too much of the world's noise and none of its meaning. She looked out at the skyline, where countless lights glittered like false stars, and whispered, "I can't feel anything anymore." The wind stirred her hair. The city hummed with electricity and exhaustion. Yet beneath it all, beneath the metal, the motion, the endless sound, something ancient stirred. Faint vibration pressed against her chest, small at first, then growing, a warmth, a memory, a note she could not name. She placed her hand over her heart and froze. The hum deepened. She heard it. It was not the hum of machines, nor the beat of her pulse. It was older, softer, the same sound that had once filled the valley, the same rhythm that had carried through David's harp, Solomon's prayers, Sarai's loom, and Alien's breath. The silence had found her. Tears welled in her eyes. "What are you?" she whispered. And the answer came, not in words but in light. A glow rose beneath her skin, faint and golden. The city lights dimmed. For a moment the towers fell silent. Screens flickered and stilled. The world seemed to hold its breath as the hum spread outward, rippling through steel and stone, through concrete and cloud. People paused mid-step in the streets below. Conversations faltered. The noise that had drowned out wonder for centuries faded into awe. The hum filled everything, vast and intimate, infinite and tender. Amara lifted her gaze to the stars, now bright above the quiet city, and whispered, "You've come back." And in that instant, across oceans and continents, others heard it too, children in their beds, elders in prayer, lovers in silence, strangers in grief. The sound was not confined to place. It was the pulse of creation itself, remembering its own origin. The soundless flame had returned, not to a temple or a throne, but to the heart of a weary generation. It did not blaze or command. It simply glowed, quiet and merciful, asking only to be remembered. And so, for the first time in ages, humanity fell still, not in fear but in reverence. The world, loud and fractured, bowed once more to the quiet that had always been its beginning. The hum that had shaped the first stars now lived again in every breath. Beneath that holy silence, the sword of David, resting somewhere deep beneath the bones of the earth, trembled once more, not in sorrow but in joy. It had waded through flood and fire, empire and ruin, only to be found again not by kings but by listeners. And as dawn rose upon that quiet world, the flame beneath creation whispered once more, "Be still and know." Before the sun rose, before the noise returned, the world hung in a silence so deep it could have been mistaken for eternity itself. Cities slept beneath that quiet like children resting upon the chest of God. The wind did not move. The sea held its breath. And for the first time since the beginning, all creation shared the same rhythm, one long, gentle exhale. In that breath, light began to change. It did not blaze from the heavens as it once had. Did not pour from swords or temples. It rose instead from within, from skin, from stone, from water, from the very dust of the earth. It was not light that sought to be seen. It was light that sought to see. Amara stood upon her rooftop, watching as dawn unfurled across the horizon, slow and patient. The hum within her still pulsed, but now it was joined by something greater, a vast silence that carried meaning without words. She could feel it speaking to her, not through sound but through understanding. You were never separate from the light, it seemed to say. You were only unlistened to. She closed her eyes, and for an instant the veil between all things thinned. She saw time not as a line, but as a river flowing backward and forward, cradling every soul that had ever been. She saw David kneeling in the rain, his harp glowing like a flame cupped between trembling hands. She saw Solomon weeping upon his throne, the sword beneath him whispering mercy. She saw Elior singing in the temple, Sarai weaving light from silence, alien breathing flame into the sea wind. And then she saw herself, not separate from them but part of the same note. Each life, each era, each act of listening was a single sound in an infinite chord, a chord that had never stopped playing. Humanity had mistaken it for silence only because it was too vast to hear all at once. Amara gasped, her hands trembling. The light around her brightened until the air itself shimmered. She saw threads of gold weaving through everything, through people, through buildings, through clouds. Each thread hummed softly, the same tone, the same promise. The fire beneath the silence is the light within all things. Her knees buckled and she fell gently to the ground. The rooftop beneath her felt alive, pulsing with a heartbeat not her own. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered, "Then the sword was never meant to be found, it was meant to be remembered." And the silence replied, not in words, but in warmth that flooded her from within. Far across the world others felt it too. In a cathedral in Rome, a candle relit itself before a weeping priest. In a monastery in Tibet, bells began to chime though no hands touched them. In a small village in Ethiopia, an old woman awoke from a dream and found her room glowing with soft gold. In the deserts, the sand sang. In the oceans, the tides whispered. The flame that had hidden beneath the silence for eons had found its voice again, not in sound but in awareness. The sword of David did not rise from the earth. It did not strike. It did not burn. It opened. The ground beneath ancient ruins shimmered faintly and light seeped upward through the stones like water. The blade lay there still, but now its form was made of pure radiance, transparent as glass. Its hum resonated through mountains, through atoms, through stars. The cosmos itself shivered with memory. And from the deepest part of creation came a voice vast as oceans, soft as breath. There was never a sword, only a song that remembered its shape. In that moment something shifted in all who listened. They understood not with mind but with soul that the wars they waged, the temples they built, the pain they carried had all been echoes of the same longing, to remember the sound of God before it was named. The world began to glow, not brighter, not louder, but clearer. The silence had finally spoken. It had always been speaking, and now humanity was quiet enough to hear. The morning after the silence spoke, the world moved differently. The air was not lighter, yet it carried peace. The noise of industry, the cries of cities, the endless motion of men, all softened as though filtered through mercy. Time itself seemed to walk more slowly, giving space for breath, for stillness, for wonder. Amara wandered through the streets barefoot, her eyes wide with quiet awe. The towers that had once loomed above her now glowed faintly, each one humming with the same tone that lived within her. She watched strangers pause mid-step, heads tilting as though listening to something far away, though it was not far at all. It was inside them. Children laughed without reason. Vendors in the market who had shouted and quarreled for years now spoke in gentle voices. The noise of the world was still there, but it no longer hurt. It had become harmony, 1,000 tones woven together into one vast, breathing chord. As Amara walked, she began to see the threads again, strands of light connecting every person, every sound, every gesture. They stretched through the air like veins of living gold. Each time someone smiled, one thread brightened. Each time someone forgave, another pulsed. The world was becoming luminous not through power, but through tenderness. She reached the edge of the city where the river flowed beneath an old bridge, and there she found an elder sitting alone, staring into the water. His hair was white, his eyes clear as morning rain. When she approached, he smiled as though he had been waiting for her. "You've heard it too," he said. She nodded. "It never stopped." The man chuckled softly. "No, child, we simply forgot to be still enough to notice." He dipped his hand into the water, ripples spreading outward in perfect circles. The soundless flame has always been here. Even when men made war in its name, it remained beneath their fury, patient as light under ash. Amara sat beside him. "It feels like everything is remembering." "It is," he said, "but remembrance is only the beginning. The light that speaks without sound is not meant to end in awe. It is meant to move through kindness, through the smallest gesture, through every act that bridges one heart to another. The sword sang once to wake kings. Now it sings through us to keep the world alive. She gazed at her reflection in the river. The water shimmered, her image framed in gold. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. He looked at her with eyes that seemed older than time. You don't have to do, you only have to be. Listen, live gently, let the light move through you. That is all it ever wanted. The river glowed faintly as he spoke. The reflection of the sky rippled, and for a moment she saw not clouds but faces: David, Solomon, Sarah, Elior, Alien, all smiling, all luminous, all part of the same flame. Tears filled her eyes. They never died, she whispered. They couldn't, said the elder. They were never bodies, they were notes in the eternal song, and now you are one of them. The hum deepened, resonating through the bridge, through the water, through her bones. The light rose in spirals, gold and white, wrapping around them both. The elder placed a hand over her heart. Listen, he said again. Amara closed her eyes. The sound filled her completely, not outside, not within, but everywhere at once. It was the sound of wind through eternity, of breath before speech, of love before memory. She understood at last what the silence had been waiting for, not to be broken, but to be shared. The elder's voice faded, though his smile remained. When light learns to listen, he whispered, darkness becomes music. When she opened her eyes, he was gone. Only the river remained, shimmering with light that no sun could cast. She rose slowly, the hum following her every step. The world was not new, it was remembered. And as she walked back through the city, the people felt it again, that quiet joy, that strange holiness that asked nothing but stillness. The light that spoke without sound had returned, not to teach, not to command, but to dwell. And in the rhythm of her heartbeat, she heard it whisper once more, be still and carry the fire. By nightfall, the hum had spread farther than light. It moved through air and water, through iron and bone. It whispered in the dreams of strangers, crossed oceans without current, and sank into the quiet hearts of those who had forgotten wonder. It carried no doctrine, no command, only remembrance. It was as though creation itself had begun to exhale again after holding its breath for millennia. Amara wandered beyond the city that night. The streets had emptied, yet every window glowed faintly, not from flame or electricity, but from something within. Even the stars seemed closer, larger, slower, more alive. She followed the river upstream until she reached the hills. There she lay upon the grass, her palms open to the sky, the hum rising softly through her body like prayer made of light. Above her, the constellations trembled. The wind brushed her hair and carried the scent of rain. In the stillness, she began to see it all not as a vision but as recognition. The stars were not distant. The earth was not low. All things were woven together by the same invisible thread, glowing with the same living tone. For the first time, she understood that the sword of David had never been buried in stone, nor reborn in children or kings, nor hidden in fire or cloth. It was here, everywhere, reflected in the smallest acts of grace. It was not a weapon. It was a language, one that could only be spoken through silence. She sat up slowly, her breath visible in the cool air, though it shimmered faintly like gold dust. So this is what it means, she whispered. The sword was a word, the word was a sound, and the sound was love. The earth beneath her seemed to agree, vibrating softly like laughter in a dream. She rose and began to walk, barefoot across the hills, guided not by sight but by resonance. Each step she took left a faint glow in the grass, which faded gently behind her, as if the world were remembering its own footsteps. In the distance, she could see lights flickering across the plains, not torches or fires, but hearts awakening one by one across the sleeping world. Everywhere she passed, silence followed, not emptiness but peace. Cattle lay quietly in the fields. Rivers slowed their current. The wind moved with rhythm, whispering soft harmonies as if singing to itself. The earth had learned to listen again. When she reached the top of the last hill, she saw it, far beyond the horizon, a faint golden glow rising from the ruins of Jerusalem. It pulsed like a heartbeat, the ancient city alive once more with the light of remembrance. The hum swelled within her chest until it became unbearable in its beauty. She fell to her knees and pressed her hands to the ground. "I can feel you," she whispered. "All of you. David, Solomon, Sarai, Elior, Alien, you're not gone." The air shimmered, and for a moment the world grew transparent. Through it she saw them not as ghosts, but as light forms, human and divine all at once, standing together upon the edges of eternity. They smiled at her with eyes that carried galaxies. David spoke first, though his lips did not move. "You are the echo that completes the song." Solomon's voice followed, gentle and knowing. "Wisdom kneels again and mercy rises." Sarai's hands wove through the air, her loom invisible yet radiant. "The threads have found their home." Elior, still a child of light, sang softly. "The hum has become heart again." An alien, the boy who had once breathed the flame into the world, whispered through the wind, "You are the final breath of the silence, the one that turns listening into life." Amara bowed her head as tears fell, glowing where they touched the earth. "Then what happens now?" she asked. "Now that the world remembers." David smiled, his light flickering like fire over water. "Now the world learns to keep remembering." Then the vision faded. The stars brightened once more. The wind resumed its gentle rhythm, carrying the hum onward to new hearts waiting to awaken. Amara lay back upon the earth, her body glowing softly in the night. She did not need to understand anymore. She only needed to listen. And in that listening, the sword, now pure light, now pure love, passed wholly into her. The world exhaled, and the silence, for the first time, sang without sound. The dawn that followed was unlike any dawn before it. The sky did not simply brighten, it blossomed. Gold unfurled through the clouds like veins of living fire, and the light that rose was not bound by horizon or time. It came from everywhere at once, from water, from dust, from breath, from the hearts of those who had remembered. Amara woke to that glow, her face warm, her body weightless. The hum was still there, softer now, almost imperceptible, yet she knew it filled everything. She stood slowly, gazing at the rising sun. For the first time she realized that it did not rise at all, it revealed itself. It had always been shining, even when the world forgot how to see. As she descended from the hill, she felt the silence following her, not as emptiness but as company. It was the same silence that had waited beneath the throne of Solomon, the same silence that had cradled David's tears, that had watched over Sarai's loom and Alien's lamps. It was the silence that held creation together when all else broke apart. When she reached the valley, she found others there, wanderers, pilgrims, seekers, ordinary souls drawn by a voice they could not name. Some were young, some ancient. Some walked with staffs, others with bare feet. They looked at her and saw in her eyes the reflection of what they themselves had begun to feel, a warmth they could neither summon nor deny. She said nothing to them. Words would have broken the perfection of that moment. She simply stood, breathing, listening. The wind moved through the grass in slow, golden waves, and one by one they followed her gaze toward the horizon. The hum deepened. It was everywhere beneath their feet, behind their ribs, inside their breath. It spoke in stillness, "Behold what was never lost." A child in the crowd began to laugh, not with amusement, but with pure wonder. The laughter spread, gentle and contagious. The elder beside him began to weep. A young woman knelt in the soil and pressed her hands into it, whispering thanks. A man lifted his arms to the sky and felt it pulse through him like forgiveness. And then, as though guided by memory older than the stars, they began to hum together. Not perfectly, not in harmony as music would define it, but as hearts define it, each voice joining another, weaving tone upon tone until the whole valley became one sound, vast and alive. The sound was not loud. It was not meant to be. It was the same note that had been born when light first touched water, when God first said be. It was the same hum that had waited beneath the sword of David since time began. Amara closed her eyes, her tears falling freely. The people's hum merged with the sound of wind, of river, of sky, and somewhere far beneath them, deep in the heart of the earth, the sword glowed once more. Its light spread upward through roots, through stone, through soil, until the entire valley shimmered with quiet fire. The weapon that had once divided heaven and earth had now become the thread that bound them. It would never be wielded again because it no longer needed to be. It was everywhere. When the hum faded, the people did not speak. They bowed their heads not to a queen, not to a god, but to the holiness that lived within them. Amara smiled through her tears. The silence had not been conquered, it had been completed. She looked to the horizon one last time and whispered into the morning air, "May the world never forget how to listen." The wind carried her words away, scattering them like seeds across the earth. And wherever they fell, in cities, in deserts, in oceans, in hearts, something stirred. The silence shifted, humming faintly again as if smiling. And far below, where the sword of David rested, its final whisper echoed through the bones of creation. The war is over. The song remains. The light that spoke without sound filled the world once more, not to end it, but to begin it again. And the hum, eternal and unseen, continued beneath every heartbeat, every breath, every pause between words, a soft and sacred reminder that silence was never the absence of God. It was always His voice.